Welcome to the Tenet Podcast. I'm Todd Pearson here with my friend, my partner, known to many as quite possibly the most interesting man in the world, co-host extraordinaire, Wes Brown.
Hey, Todd. How you doing, buddy? It's good to see you on a beautiful snowy Saturday in South Dakota.
Yeah, it's still a little bit chilly here in Colorado, too.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to take a moment and give a shout out to you, our listeners. A number of you have shared with us your Spotify Wrapped for the year, and to see that we have made it into your top podcast is really wonderful, and it definitely warms our hearts. So thank you. That means the world to us, and it keeps us energized, along with your lovely comments that many of you post on social media. We're very thankful for all of you that take the time to listen. All right, let's talk some art, Wes Brown.
All right, I'm looking forward to it.
Are you ready?
I'm stoked. I'm stoked today. Yeah.
Is your seatbelt securely fastened?
I have it cinched down tight.
Is your seat and tray in the full upright position?
I'm ready for takeoff, man.
Excellent. You know why?
Why?
We're going on a trip across the pond, as they say, albeit virtually. We're absolutely over the moon to talk with our next guest. He's had a storied career that spans close to 60 years. If you're not familiar with his name, I guarantee you know his photographic work. He has made some of the most iconic photographs in the world of rock and roll, working with bands and musicians like the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, Slade, Elton John, the Eurythmics, Kate Bush, Oasis, and the list goes on and on, in addition to doing editorial and advertising work. It's an honor to welcome to the program, Gered Mankowitz. Welcome. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. And I'm good. I'm talking to you from a not snowy and not particularly cold Cornwall in the southwest of England. It's terribly damp though and miserable. So we're not wildly happy. I think I'd prefer if it was properly cold and snowy, but there we go. Anyway, good to be with you guys.
Thank you. Do you get a lot of snow there in that part of England?
No, we don't really. Cornwall is sticking out into the Atlantic. So, we ask for rain, really. Everything comes up from the southwest and we get blown about a bit and occasionally get a bit of snow. But generally, if we have bad weather, it's wet weather. That's it. When it's beautiful, it's really, really beautiful. But we do have long periods of miserable wetness, and we're going through one of those right now.
How long have you lived in Cornwall?
Over 12 years. We left London just over 12 years ago, and I was born and bred in London, worked in London, had my studios in London, and then got rid of my studio, began to wind down my commercial photography business, and concentrated increasingly on the archive, which is what I've been doing ever since. And once I had done that, I realized that we could do that anywhere. And so we moved to the country and settled on Cornwall, which is a most beautiful county, and somewhere that we visited endlessly on holidays. And so, yeah, that's why we're here. And I work I'm talking to you from my office, which is in the garden of our home. And it's a wonderful place to be, particularly now, because we're all, I'm not sure what it's like with you guys at the moment, but here in England, we're going through a COVID crisis. Nobody knows what to do. And our government is quietly panicking, hoping that they don't have to lock down for Christmas. So we're happy enough, we're locked down anyway, because we don't go anywhere. So we're fine.
Yeah, it's nice to be in a nice place if you have to wait this whole thing out, right?
Yes, and we're lucky, we're surrounded by beautiful countryside. We step out of our garden into a beautiful wood, and we can walk, and so we're good. We're coping well, but it's mad and it's awful and it's dreadful for millions and millions of other people. So and there's a sort of mental anguish well, whatever your situation, there's a degree of mental anguish. And so, yeah, but we're dealing with it pretty well. Thank goodness.
Yeah, good. Hey, before we get started, I want to direct our listeners to your website and Instagram. So Gered's website is Mankowitz.com, and that's spelled Mankowitz. And you can find him on Instagram at Gered_Mankowitz. So check those out while we're having this conversation today, and you'll see just how many incredible images he's made over the span of his career. I want to start off by talking about a little bit of your history of how you got into photography, because it's a very interesting story, and you started at quite a young age.
I did. Yeah, I did. I was born in 1946, and so my early youth, when I was 11, 12, that sort of thing, a few happy snaps, a few home snaps, but nobody in the family was a keen amateur photographer or anything like that. But my father was a bit of a celebrity. He was a writer, producer, and he was well known. And we had photographers come to the house to photograph him and the family, and we were quite used to that. And I was always intrigued by the process, and I always loved the equipment, and I loved I love the lighting. When a photographer came along and lit the house, I was always intrigued and attracted to that. And because of my father, I'd visited film sets, and I'd gone to backstage at the theater, and I was mad keen to be an actor. And I had a great dressing up box, and I would dress myself up in different characters. And, so I was always leading quite a sort of theatrical sort of life. And one day, the actor, comedian Peter Sellers came to Sunday lunch because my dad was working with him on a project, and he had just finished, Peter Sellers had just finished filming Tom Thumb. And he arrived at the house, and he was a mad, enthusiastic, obsessive amateur photographer. And he arrived with a full Hasselblad kit and a Polaroid, an old, well, it wasn't old then, it was all very new, but a big Polaroid with a fold-out front, and that took 5x4-inch Polaroids. And he started taking photographs of me and my brother, and he arranged it so that my brother appeared to be standing in the palm of my hand like Tom Thumb. And then he, opened the Polaroid, and within a few, what felt like instantly, there was this extraordinary black and white photograph, and there was my brother standing, and I was just knocked out. I thought, wow, this is wonderful. And, I could see how he set it up and everything. And then he proceeded to show me the Hasselblad. And in those days, he had the full kit. So he had a Hasselblad 500C camera with about 3 lenses. And he showed it to me, took it apart. He put one lens on after another, and he let me hold it. But he did it all in a mad Swedish chef type voice. And I was weeping with laughter. He was so funny. And like all great comedians, if he gets you laughing, he won't let go. He won't stop. He's like a terrier with a joke. He just he just wants you to curl up on the floor in hysterics. And that's pretty much how I was. But I was loving this Hasselblad camera. And when he finally left and I dried my tears of laughter, I said to my dad, I think I want to be a photographer. I think I'm 11 or 12 at this point in time. So I think I want to be a photographer, Dad, and I want a Hasselblad. So he sort of took it with a pinch of salt. But from that moment on, there was a real focus. And I think the family got together, and next Christmas, I was given a funny little camera as far removed from a Hasselblad as you can imagine. It's called a Bensini Comet. It came from Boots the Chemist, which is like Walmart in America. And I started taking pictures with that, just family snaps. And we'd have to send them off to the pharmacy to get them processed and everything. But somehow it just got to me then. And I knew that this was what I wanted to do. And everything about my life then, I sort of geared up towards being a photographer. And the next big turning point was I went on the school holiday to Holland when I was about 13, 14. And I took some pictures of Delft Cathedral, very famous cathedral. And I took these pictures of its twin spires. And when I got home and we got them processed, my dad thought there was something really good about them. And he asked a friend of his, a professional photographer who'd photographed us all as a family, called Tom Blau, who was the owner of a photo agency called Camera Press, which still exists actually. And Tom Blau very generously actually bought a couple of my pictures of Delft Cathedral for the Camera Press library. But the most important thing of all was that he offered me an apprenticeship. He said, if I really wanted to pursue photography, then I could have an apprenticeship at Camera Press. And in those days, you could leave school when you were 15. And I was 15 in the middle of the summer vacation. So I left when I was 14 and 3 bits or whatever, and got out of there and went and started this apprenticeship. And that was it. And there was no turning back. And I never imagined that I would ever do anything else. And and that was it. So I guess that's about 1961, something like that.
That is absolutely amazing. You know, some people spend their entire lives searching for that thing that, you know, really gets them excited or what they want to do in life. And to have that kind of experience at such a young age, I just think that's phenomenal.
Yes, I suppose it is. I mean, it was phenomenal. And you see, the thing is that it is your life. And my parents were very supportive. I mean, you know, they didn't think I was going to do particularly well at school. They didn't think that staying at school and pursuing some sort of academic career, or at least taking exam. I never took one single exam. You know, I'm about the most unqualified person you can imagine. But I'm an enthusiast, and I really wanted to be a photographer, and I wanted to be a photographer in show business. I didn't really know what part of show business, but because of this background that I'd had, you know, I'd seen photographers come to the house, as I've already said, but I also saw photographs in the theater and photographs on a movie set, and I imagined that I would be doing that. That's what I thought I would do. And I also naively thought that it would lead to a career as a film director. I never imagined that photography would be the be all and end all. I just knew I wanted to do that. I thought it was going to lead me to, you know, an exciting, dramatic, romantic, and glamorous life as a film director. So I just ended up as a sort of working photographer, but I was in show business, and that was all that really mattered.
And you spoke to how your parents were very supportive of your pursuit of photography. I saw a video of you talking in another interview that your dad helped you purchase your first Hasselblad, the camera that you initially fell in love with. Talk a little bit about that.
He did. Well, when I was born, my dad took out I guess it's a life insurance policy on me. You know, it was a tiny little policy. It was like a few bucks a month or something like that. Just, I guess, you know, that was what you did in those days. You didn't have very much money, but you put a couple of bucks every month into this little policy. And he said to me, look, you know, you've got this little policy and it's worth about £500. And, you know, maybe a good investment for you now would be to buy the camera. And so he had an office in Piccadilly Arcade, which is right in central London. And a couple of doors down, there was the Piccadilly Photo Centre. And I'd been there a couple of times and looked in their windows, and, you know, it was just a beautiful place to go if you like cameras. And so we went there and I bought a Hasselblad, and it was £346 and 17 shillings or something like that. And I bought a couple of extra lenses, and I think they gave me a case for everything, and it came to about 500 quid. And so that's how I got my first Hasselblad. And my dad, being a professional, a self-employed professional all his life, was a great believer that, if you're going to do something, you better do it properly. You can't sort of mess around. So you better do it properly. And if you're going to be a photographer, you've got to have a good camera. And that was that. So I had a Hasselblad when I was, I think I'm about 16, maybe just about 16. I had a Hasselblad kit. And that was that.
That was so incredibly insightful of your father at that time. I can't imagine, even in this day and age, and buying a medium format camera for your kid. I mean, most people wouldn't have done that, but your dad had the insight and saw the enthusiasm and how taken you were with photography, that he wanted to support that. I think that's just amazing.
Well, yeah, he was a great support to me. I mean, my parents were always very supportive. I mean, they were highly critical, and often my father was extremely difficult, and he and I clashed on numerous occasions. But I think that he understood that I was really focused on being a photographer at that time. And I think his other thinking was that I wasn't going to go to college. I wasn't going to go to university. I just wasn't going to do that. I wasn't an academic person. I struggled learning academically. I wasn't very good. I was a late reader. I was probably dyslexic, although nobody knew about that then. And I think he felt that rather than support me through college, because in America, I know everybody works their way through college, but in England, there was it was slightly different, I think. And I think that, parents, if they could, they supported their kids in college, a university. And I guess if you needed to do a bit of part-time work for pocket money, that was cool. But he just felt that it was pointless to invest any money in me going to college. So he might as well invest some money in me, in helping me become a photographer and giving me a really good leg up. And in regards to the life policy, I think he felt that was my money, and he just encouraged me to use it wisely and, and not blow it. So yes, very supportive and very insightful, and always a sort of important guiding light to me. Always, even when we were clashing and screaming at each other, there was always something positive at the end of the fight.
When you worked at Camera Press with Tom, that you pretty much worked all the different positions, didn't you?
I did. As it turned out, I had a very concentrated apprenticeship, and that's another story. But Tom put me through everything. It was like 2 weeks in the darkroom. It was first 2 weeks in the gentleman's lavatory mixing chemicals. That was where it all began. Because I was like the junior. I was the junior's assistant. And amongst my other tasks was mixing great buckets of chemicals, because in those days they were distributing photographs by sending out little 10-8 glosses, but by the thousands. And they would distribute photographs to every publication in the world by mail. So every week, a package of 10-8 glosses, of portraits, of cartoons, of glamorous pictures of actresses and actors, latest portraits, Karsh of Ottawa's latest portrait, or whatever it was. They would go out to thousands and thousands of publications all over the world who subscribed to the Camera Press service. And they had darkrooms where they were printing hundreds of prints at a time, hand processing hundreds of prints, drying hundreds of prints on huge rotary dryers. And the junior's first job was to mix the chemicals, because they were consuming baths of chemicals. So I was in the lavatory stirring up giant buckets of horrible, disgusting chemicals with no protection whatsoever. But I, it was a real basement type introduction. And then I went into the darkroom to start assisting the printers and processing all this stuff and so on. And then I was in the studio, and then he sent me on assignments. I mean, after about 6 weeks, he handed me a Rolleiflex. He didn't give it to me. He handed me a Rolleiflex medium format camera and sent me off to photograph. I remember one of the things he asked me to do was to go to London Zoo and photograph Guy the gorilla, who was a very famous gorilla that they had at the London Zoo. And he was a celebrity and a personality in his own right. And so one of my first jobs was to photograph Guy the gorilla.
That's awesome. I love that. I love that. I love when you think celebrity photography, you don't think of Guy the gorilla.
Yeah, Guy the gorilla. Yeah. Yes, I would have preferred, Marilyn Monroe or Joan Collins, but I got Guy the gorilla. Anyway, listen, it's all a good start. I think what was great was that it was right in the world of professional photography, and it was marvelous. But I have to say now that the greatest thing that Camera Press gave me, the most important thing, was access to thousands of wonderful photographs. And every day I saw marvelous photographs, and of all different types. And that was an education in itself. I mean, it was my life I was in that place for about 3, maybe 4 months. And then, very weirdly, my father, for reasons that have never really been fully understood, he took us all, the whole family, he took to Barbados in the West Indies. And we really don't know why. It's a family mystery that has never been fully understood. There's a bit of speculation. There was speculation at the time that my father, who was part of the CND, the nuclear disarmament movement, had heard on the grapevine that there was a nuclear conflict building up, because, this is Cold War time, and the bomb was hovering over us, and not that I paid it much attention, I have to say. But anyway, I think he honestly thought for a moment there that he had to get the family out of Europe. So he took us to the Caribbean, a few hundred miles from Cuba. And you know what happens next. So it turned out to be out of the frying pan into the fire. Anyway, the Cuban Missile Crisis went off, but we were okay. But I went to Barbados. I was considered too young to stay in London by myself. And so they whisked me out of Camera Press, had my Hasselblad, and the idea was that I was going to start my career in Barbados. And that's what I did, actually. I mean, I really did. I had to be driven to appointments, but I started taking photographs. I started photographing kids, and I photographing portraits of families, and I photographed houses for a local architect. I even photographed the first Boeing 707 to land on the island, for BOAC or Air West Indies or whatever it was called. I just got thrown in, and my dad basically said, there you go. Swim and see what happens. And that's basically what I did. I didn't know what I was doing. I'll tell you a story about my first darkroom, because I built a darkroom, and I'd only ever seen. You see, I never went through any of that things that kids usually go through, where you set up a darkroom under the stairs or in a bathroom or something. I never did any of that. My first darkroom experience was at Camera Press. And they had these huge professional darkrooms where they processed, all the chemicals were in great big sinks. We call them butler's sinks. I don't know what we call them in America, but great big ceramic sinks. And I didn't know any different. And so when we built the darkroom, I put in 3 of these ceramic sinks. But I was only doing like 3 or 4 prints a day, if that. And of course, the chemicals go off overnight. So I had to go down to the Kodak dealer in Bridgetown, Barbados, to get more chemicals. And he said to me, he said, man, you're going through chemicals. Like, what's happening? What are you doing? So I explained to him, he said, oh my God. He said, you need a dish. What size prints are you making? I said, 10 by 8s. He said, well, you need a 10 by 8 dish and you just use like a few ounces. You don't use gallons at a time, which is what I was doing. And so he put me right. He sold me a set of dishes and he set me right. And then I started, that's how I learned. I learned by making all these mistakes over and over again. That's
I love that. That's such a wonderful story. Yeah, because the only thing you'd been exposed to was this huge commercial scenario where they're running thousands of prints, right? And
yeah,
so that's what you knew.
That's right. That's what I thought I had to do. I mean, I had a beautiful darkroom. And I was extremely pleased with it, but it was a professional darkroom, and there I was, a 15-year-old amateur trying to take pictures, trying to fulfill assignments. But I mean, I think the most I ever printed in a day was perhaps 10 by 8s. And anyway, I learned, and it was a good way to learn, and it taught me. If you make mistakes and you learn from them, you never make those mistakes again. And it's a very, very good grounding if you've got the support to do it like that.
Yeah, they're not failures. They're learning experiences that you take away from and you build upon, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the first time I ever processed film, they gave me a load of film and I thought that it was important film. And I was going to say a swear word. I screwed it up. And I was in a terrible state, but they'd given me unexposed film as just to give me the lesson. It sounds cruel now, but it was actually a really good lesson again. And I never messed up again. I got it right because I got it so terribly wrong and I didn't do any harm. And everybody was they thought it was terribly funny, but but I learned, and that's how I learned in those days. And I learned by making these ridiculous elementary mistakes because I'd had no grounding. This was how it all began.
So how long were you in Barbados?
Well, I think we were in there the best part of a year. And then my dad realized that whatever was going to happen had already happened. And the whole Havana missile Cuba thing got sorted out. And that took the wind out of the Cold War a little bit. And so he took us back. We went back to Barbados. He went back every winter to Barbados for a few years, but he took us back and I went and started working as an assistant. And one of my first assistant's jobs was with a marvelous fashion photographer called Alec Murray. He was an absolutely wonderful, very, very elegant, tall, slim man, an Australian actually. And he was a fashion photographer, and his primary client was something called Australian Consolidated Press, which was a huge organization, one of the biggest publishers in Australia at the time. And he shot everything on large format, which is pretty much what people tended to do in those days. And so this was a marvelous introduction to large format, loading 5:4 slides. Large format is 5 by 4 inch film that you load one sheet at a time, and you load it into slides which have one sheet either side, and you put them into this big 5 by 4 camera and expose one side, take the slide out, turn it round. So I did all that, and it was a really exciting introduction to what I found a very strange world. I didn't like the fashion world at all. The one thing I learned with Alec was that I didn't want to be a fashion photographer, but I learned a lot of lighting stuff from him and a lot about large format from him. So again, age 16, I'm learning about large format fashion photography, which was, again, a really interesting exercise, but I also knew I didn't want to be a fashion photographer. And there's a funny story here too, because in those days, he took me to Paris for the autumn fashions of, I suppose it was 62. I'm not sure, but yes, 62 and 61 or 62. And he took me to Paris, which was exciting anyway. And in those days, all the photographers, all the models, all the editors, everybody ended the evening at a wonderful restaurant in the market area of Paris. Huge, great brasserie. And so everybody's there, all the photographers are there, all the models are there. It's very glamorous, it's very exciting. And I'm just in awe. I'm just this scruffy little chubby kid, and I'm just in awe of it all. And there was a great deal of noise coming from one corner. Great deal of loud laughing and swearing, and there was a beautiful model dancing on a table, and it was just insane. And Alec sort of leaned over to me and he said, "Don't pay any attention to that lot. They're very, very naughty boys, and you don't want to." And it turned out that there was David Bailey, Duffy, and Terence Donovan, three of the greatest British photographers of all time, and the sort of enfant terrible of the fashion world at that moment in time. And so that was my introduction to David Bailey, who sort of haunted my career ever since, and in one way or the other. So I was instructed very much not to pay attention. It was like, look away, there's nothing happening here. And yet I couldn't resist. It was too exciting for words,
Oh, what a great story. So were you friends with David Bailey?
No, never. No, I met him a few times, had a bit of a chat once or twice. There used to be a place that we both happened to go to called the Pickwick Club. And he came in a couple of times and we nodded, but I never had anything to do with his world. I never had, once I'd finished with Alec, I never, ever had anything to do with the fashion world. Per se, I never shot for Vogue. I never had anything appear in Vogue. So my world was very, very different from his. I knew about him, of course, from that moment on. I mean, you couldn't escape him if you were a photographer in London. And our paths crossed on numerous occasions. I mean, I photographed Marianne Faithfull in 1964, and so did Bailey. And Bailey did a very famous portrait of her on Primrose Hill around about that time. And I did, very famous portrait of her in the Salisbury pub around about the same time. And when I started photographing the Stones in 1965, Bailey had done the previous sessions with them. So, that's what I mean by being haunted by Bailey, And Andrew Loog Oldham, who managed the Rolling Stones, sort of taunted me slightly, by saying, if you don't do good with the boys, I'm going to take them back to Bailey. So there was always, Bailey was like a sort of shadow, looming. And of course, he was a brilliant photographer and a great, technician and well advanced on me. I mean, he's much older than me. Doesn't seem as though he's that much older now, but then in those days, he was much older than me. And those 5 or 6 years that he's got on me, they were crucial at that point. So he was a much more sophisticated, a much more experienced photographer than I was. But yeah, he was shadowing me. He appears all over my life as Bailey looming somewhere, somehow.
I'm glad you elaborated on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So what didn't strike you, or what didn't you care for as far as the whole fashion world? Just the way it operated, or too pretentious, or what was it that didn't grab you?
It wasn't really so much its pretension. It was just, I didn't like the people. There was a real hierarchy. The editor who we had to work with all the time was a horribly loud, bossy, unpleasant woman. The models were very, very aloof. I mean, not only were they tall and beautiful, but they were aloof and snobby. And, one of the reasons why Jean Shrimpton and her generation of models was so wonderful was that they were lovely people. But the generation before, they were great looking, handsome women and often marvelous models, but they weren't particularly nice to be around unless you were part of their scene. And of course, as a little junior assistant, I was definitely not part of the scene. And I just felt, that this wasn't a world that I wanted to have anything to do with. It wasn't really so much to do with the photography, which was curiously uncreative. There was very, very creative. Bailey, Duffy, Donovan, Avedon, Penn, all these marvelous photographers were doing the most wonderful work. Alec wasn't quite in that sort of class. He was a solid journeyman photographer, technically really good. And he did beautiful fashion photographs, but they weren't inspired artistically, particularly. And I just didn't like the world. I just thought it wasn't for me. And talking about learning from your mistakes, you learn, it's really important to learn what isn't for you early on. I was very lucky learning that because I didn't waste any time trying to be a fashion photographer, which wouldn't have worked for me. I'm not interested in clothes. I'm not interested in fashion, really. I do like looking at great fashion photographs, but I've never been interested in clothes. So, it wouldn't have worked for me. So that was another important life lesson learnt young.
Part of finding your voice as a photographer, right? Like you had to have that experience. No, I don't want to do that type of photography.
Yes. No, that's absolutely right. I learned very early. I learned in Barbados that I wasn't a good photojournalist or reportage photographer. I couldn't photograph people who didn't want to be photographed. I was trying to take pictures in a village, and a woman threw stones at me because she thought I was going to steal her soul with my camera. I didn't like that. I didn't want to impose myself on people. I wanted to work with people. I learned that very, very early on. And, so I knew I wasn't going to be a war photographer or a reportage photographer. And I knew from Tom Blau at Camera Press that I wasn't really cut out to be a journalistic photographer either. Tom Blau had the most fantastic ability to tell a story in half a dozen pictures, to create a magazine spread for Life or Look or any of those magazines. I didn't really have that. That wasn't really me. I was more interested in portraiture from quite early on. And my next job as an assistant was with a marvelous photographer called Jeff Vickers, who was a commercial photographer who specialized in theater, photographing actors, but also photographing plays, which was an area that I was very interested in. And so that was a great opportunity. And Jeff remained a friend and a sort of a mentor for a long time. And that's really how I got into theater photography and working with actors.
That experience is what really kind of set you on this path, right?
It did, because two of the young actors I photographed sang as Chad and Jeremy. Now, Chad and Jeremy might not mean anything to you young guys, but Chad and Jeremy were big stars, became big stars in America. And they were sort of one of the lead acts of the early British invasion. And they toured America and had big hits in America and were very famous for quite a long time, from about 64 through until 67, maybe 68. They were big enough stars to be guest stars on Batman and Wild Wild West and Merv Griffin and Dick Van Dyke. And, they were big stars. Anyway, they weren't when I first met them, but I started photographing them as musicians. And they were signed to a small record company called Ember Records, an independent company. And Ember Records liked the pictures I'd taken of Chad and Jeremy, and they suddenly started asking me to photograph their other artists. And I realized that this was an area of showbiz that was populated by young people. You know, the subjects were all young. They were all my age, or a bit older, but they were all young kids. And we all wanted instinctively, naturally, to try and break the mold of glittery, glamorous, frilly shirted, shiny teeth and groomed hair, you know, that was showbiz. We wanted to break that mold. And so I found myself taking photographs of young artists in this business, music business, at a time when the music business was struggling to know quite how to sell to this new market, this youth market that suddenly had disposable income, wanted to buy music. And so, you know, I sort of slid in this open door that Chad and Jeremy opened for me. And I then just took this fantastic journey into music. And that was it. It was very quick. And Chad and Jeremy, through Chad and Jeremy, I met Marianne Faithfull. And through Marianne Faithfull, I met the Rolling Stones. And the rest is history.
And that all came about because Marianne Faithfull and the Stones shared the same manager, which was that Andrew Loog Oldham, right?
That's right. And I'd taken some photographs. I met Marianne socially through Chad and Jeremy. And I just thought she was absolutely gorgeous, and she was funny, and she was beautiful. And I liked As Tears Go By, which was her single, which had just come out. And I just said to her, "Can I photograph you?" And she said, "Yes, you know, that would be groovy." And so I took her off the next day, or whisked her off somewhere, I think Wimbledon Common, Wimbledon Common, which was a favorite location of mine. Started photographing her. We just got on like a house on fire. And I became very close to her, and almost immediately went into the recording studio with her and started photographing her in the studio, hanging out with them in the studio. And then I took her to the pub, this Salisbury pub, which is in St. Martin's Lane, right in the center of London's theatre district. And I did some photographs of her there, which I hope might be considered for a record cover for her first album. And she was managed by, as you pointed out, Andrew Loog Oldham, although I'd never met him, because her day-to-day management was carried out by some minions rather than Andrew, who kept in the distant background. And he saw the pub pictures and he really liked them. And I got a call saying, you know, would I come up to the office to meet his other band, the Stones? And that's what I did. And the pub picture did become the cover for Marianne's first album, or one of the first albums. And I met the Stones, and it was agreed that I would photograph them. And at my first session with them, which happened in 1965, and I did a whole series of pictures, but I did, one of the shots I did became the cover for December's Children in America and Out of Our Heads in the UK. So yeah, it was a whirlwind of opening doors and opportunities and just diving in. And as my dad had said to me a couple of years before, just swim, see what happens.
So in that Marianne Faithfull shoot that you did in the pub, well, how did you approach that? Do you use your Hasselblad or medium format, large format?
I used my Hasselblad for everything. I was shooting on the Hasselblad from the beginning, from going to Barbados. That was my go-to camera. And I never really thought about any other camera, to be honest. And then, and I shot everything on the Hasselblad. I mean, all the first Stone sessions on the Hasselblad, all the Marianne stuff is all on the Hasselblad. All the Chad and Jeremy stuff was on the Hasselblad. Everything was on the Hasselblad. And I didn't know, I mean, I was using the Hasselblad to shoot live pictures. I was using the Hasselblad to shoot available light in the recording studio. Because I didn't, number one, I didn't know any different. And number two, I was getting really nice results. You know, somebody else might have said, well, you know, you've got to use a 35 millimeter camera in this situation because the light's so low, you need the blah, blah, blah. I didn't know anything about that. So I was using, when I went to America in 65 with the Stones, I was shooting live stuff on the Hasselblad, not knowing whether I was going to get any results because the lighting was absolute rubbish. But I really didn't. I did have a Nikon. By that time, I had a Nikon F, but I didn't use it in those situations. I used it backstage a little bit, but I didn't use it on stage because I wore spectacles, and I didn't know about diopters. So I found that using spectacles on a 35 millimeter in a very hot, sweaty conditions, my glasses would steam up and I couldn't see. Whereas with the Hasselblad, which had a waist level finder, I didn't have that problem. And so the Hasselblad was my go-to camera for many, many different reasons, some practical and some aesthetic and some because the quality was just unbeatable. So yes, the Marianne Faithfull pictures were on the Hasselblad. Sorry, a long-winded answer.
I love it.
Sorry.
Nope, I love it. I love that.
Yeah, that was great.
Detail. Yeah.
And that Hasselblad, the way did you obviously if you were doing long exposures you'd be on a tripod, but you probably handheld that thing a lot, I imagine, right?
Yeah, Hasselblad's very well designed. This sounds like an advert for Hasselblad. It's a beautifully designed piece of equipment, and it has a neck cord and a waist level view. It has various different viewfinders. I used a waist level viewfinder. And if you held it properly and you used the neck cord and your chest as a brace, you could hold it very, very still. And so I could shoot handheld at about a 15th of a second. And so a lot of the live stuff of the Stones, you can see it can be beautifully sharp on the face, but the hand is completely blurred. Charlie playing drums, the face is sharp, but the hands are just a complete blur. And Keith, I've got a great picture of Keith live, which I call fast hand, because his face is sharp, but his hand is a blur. Again, I really didn't know any different. And there were some nights on the tour when I just simply couldn't take photographs because it was dark. There was only a follow spot on Mick. Nobody else was lit. And so, I'd try and take a couple of pictures from the back into the light to try and get atmosphere. But sometimes I just you couldn't see the other guys, unless Mick happened to wander in their area and the spotlight picked them up. Otherwise, it was just Mick.
Yeah, I can't even imagine because, it's challenging even in this modern day and age, though it's gotten much better with LED lighting, theater lighting and stuff. But back in the day, holy moly, like extremely difficult scenario to be photographing in.
Yeah, really difficult. And I mean, and not rewarding. I mean, at the time, I wasn't really enjoying it. I was loving the experience. I mean, listen, I was on stage every night, sometimes twice a night with the Stones. I could go anywhere as long as I didn't get in Mick's way. I had, talk about access. Nobody in those days talked about access, but I had access. I was on stage with them. I could wander around as long as I didn't get in anybody's way or trip over the cables, because the electrics in those days were just terrible. But I was taking pictures whenever I could, but I didn't feel particularly comfortable. It was like, okay, I have to shoot the lens wide open, 15th of a second, because I haven't got a chance at an 1/8. I'll have to do that, push the film as much as I could, and that was it, and hoped that I'd get something. And unfortunately, I did. And the great thing about the Hasselblad was that when you got something, it was beautiful. You might not get it all the time, but when you could get it, it was really great because you had these beautiful lenses and you had medium format and they were wonderful. Better than any 35 millimeter, even a really properly exposed 35 millimeter. For me, the Hasselblad, the quality of medium format was always great. But sometimes, I'd shoot 35 millimeter backstage where it was just felt more reportage, while the guys were playing cards or writing songs or tuning up. I might shoot certain 35mm, but the bulk of the live stuff was all medium format.
And what was difficult too, then I imagine, is that you didn't have access to the film stocks that we later had as far as fast film is concerned. And so probably 400 was probably the fastest speed you had, and then you had to push it.
Tri-X was 400, and that was a good basic film. You could push it 2 stops quite comfortably, so to 1600. And then there was a film called HPS, which Ilford made, which was 800. So you could push that 2 stops quite comfortably and to 3200 ASA. And that was pretty good. And so I think actually film was pretty advanced. I don't think film got that much better. In fact, I think it probably got steadily worse as they reduced the silver content. I think probably looking back, maybe film in the 60s and 70s was pretty damn good, I think. It certainly, it could take a battering, you could put it in sort of hot D76 and leave it for a few minutes. And as long as it didn't actually melt, you might get an exposure. So you might get a negative. So it was a bit sort of frontier land, Going back to the tour, it was a fantastic adventure and I had a wonderful time. And as I said, being on stage with the band, feeling the music, feeling the audience was just absolutely phenomenal. And I loved that. But as a photographer, I was frustrated. I didn't really find it that rewarding. And I never really toured again, to be honest. Live photography was never my particular forte after that. And I felt I'd rather failed if I had a job to do. I felt I rather failed because the lighting was so awful. And because the band, the other element was the band hated flash. They felt that it just wasn't cool. Flash wasn't cool. There were certain things in those days that were just not cool. You didn't photograph a band in the studio with their instruments. That's just not cool. And you didn't photograph, and you didn't use flash. You definitely didn't use flash when they were performing, and you didn't use flash backstage. It was all about trying to capture atmosphere and mood and feeling and a vibe. And flash just killed that. And I didn't know how to handle flash. Now, funnily enough, I had a flash with me, but in those days, I had something, I think it was called a Metz multi-blitz or something. It was an acid battery. It was a wet battery flash gun. And it was heavy. And I didn't know how to use it. We didn't have lovely little things to bounce it off. We didn't have little umbrellas. We didn't have any of that. Nobody had invented any of that. Flash was used on the camera, generally by press photographers, in your face, because they needed to get a really well-exposed, grain-free image in order to reproduce, because magazine and newspaper reproduction was absolute rubbish. It was terrible. And so that's why, and we were trying to reject that. We were trying to change the rules. We were saying if a photograph is dark and dramatic, that's how we want it. And that's, it was interesting. So, yeah, so I felt I'd failed a little bit. I'd had a wonderful experience. It was a great adventure, but I felt I'd failed photographically. And I didn't want to do it again. And so I never really toured again. I can't remember when I next toured. I think I might have toured with Slade a little bit in the 70s. But I don't think I ever toured again in the 60s. It was just, it wasn't for me. I didn't think I was any good at it.
Another one of those learning experiences, right? You're like, this isn't.
Yes. It's funny because looking back, clearly I got some great photographs from that tour, but they weren't used or needed, or nobody was interested in them. Andrew Loog Oldham told me recently that the only reason I was on the tour was to make the band feel more important, because the Beatles had taken a photographer on tour with them earlier that year, and so, you know, he wanted to make the Stones feel that they were important. And so, you know, they had their own photographer in tow. I don't think he was remotely, I mean, I didn't know this until quite recently. He told me quite recently. So nobody was really interested in the work. And if you're a professional photographer, and even though I was only, how old was I when I went to America? I was 18. 18 when I went to America. You know, I thought I was a professional photographer. And if, as a professional photographer, if your work isn't seen, if it's not published, then it's a failure. You know, and doesn't matter if you've got some quite interesting photographs. If nobody wants to publish them or use them or look at them, then it's a failure. And so I felt I'd failed and needed to move on. And live photography, I failed because I wasn't a good live photographer. And anyway, live photography was a dead end because the lighting was so awful. So that's that really.
But how fantastic that you had this front seat, this experience with the Rolling Stones early on in their career and got to go with them. I mean, who gets to do that, right? And it was just like you and the band, as I understand, right? You flew over with them and you were with them pretty much the entire time. You stayed in the same hotels, had access to them nonstop, like you said.
Yes, I was treated like a member of the band. I mean, there was no difference really. I mean, you know, I shared a room with a guy called Ronnie Schneider, who was Alan Klein's nephew and was the money man on the tour. The band wouldn't go on until he gave them the word that the money was all in the bag. And he slept with the bag under the bed. So yes, he was a lovely chap. I mean, he and I got on very well. But I mean, Mick would be on one side of me and Bill would be on another. There'd be no difference. I mean, I was treated exactly like the member of the band. And the team was very, very small because the band had Ian Stewart, who was their roadie, who had been an original member of the Rolling Stones, and he was their roadie, and that was that. There was no other roadie. The equipment was minimal. Was just a back line. Mick sang through the PA, the house PA. Sound was terrible, I guess. But the kids were screaming so much that, you know, it was just, the atmosphere was so exciting. And there was, you know, it was before, there was no sound crew, there was no lighting crew, there was no security, there was no press or PR. I mean, there was local press, but that the agents might have organized. There was an advance man who'd go to the gig ahead of you. There was a tour agent and there was a tour manager who looked after the whole tour. But I mean, it was a small family unit and it was amateur night, really. You know, some of the promoters, particularly down south, you know, have never put on a music show. They'd put on rodeos and wrestling and sporting events. So, I mean, in some of the places, the dressing rooms stank of manure because they'd had a rodeo the day before. In one dressing room in Boston, it was I don't remember what the team was called, the best Boston Celtics, a basketball team.
Yep,
yeah,
the Celtics.
And their jock straps were hanging in the dressing room. They were just hanging, you know, and nobody had even cleared them up. There were just these old, sweaty, stinking, stained jock straps. And that was the conditions of the dressing rooms. I mean, it was really, you know, it was rough-ish, I would say, you know, and that there was no catering and there was no, it was really, but it was fun, you know, and that's the way it was in those days. And it was sort of fun. And we flew out after every show before the audience had realized the band weren't coming back. We were on our way to the airport. It was the first tour they ever did where they had their own plane, which was a crappy old Martin 2 piston engine, twin engine Martin. That was, I don't know, sat 36 people or something. And Stu had to put all the equipment in the back. And it was, we had our own crew. We had 2 lovely stewardesses and 2 pilots who were called sort of, I don't know, Chuck and Stan or something. I don't know. They were classics. And they flew us everywhere. And it was, we'd fly off through the night. So, we'd leave in limos down to the airport, into the plane. They'd have a dinner. They'd have a hot dinner for us. And then at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, we'd land in somewhere, Raleigh, North Carolina, or wherever it was. And we'd go through the night, sirens and lights, nobody on the road, nobody there to meet us, but the police would spin the sirens because I guess they'd been paid to escort us. So we got the full show. And we'd end up in some terrible motel. The tour manager would say, just hand us out keys. And that was it. Nothing to do, no fans, no groupies, no drugs, no booze, no eating. You just go to your room and crash out. Nick and Keith would compose songs, and that was it, really, and that was it every night. So it was an interesting, grueling adventure that was full of incident, and I'm thrilled I did it. I never wanted to do it again.
It sounded like it was pretty staid as far as in between, but was there a lot of mayhem with fans and stuff on that tour?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of mayhem in the audience because in those days, the audience was going mad. The audience was incredibly enthusiastic. The audience would rush the stage at every opportunity, and the security was awful. So the security would be bored. We used to call them the bored bouncers, bored young men, often from the local college, a few safety people, some cops, some independent security people that the house might have booked, but they didn't know what to do. They really didn't know. And lots of shows were stopped. The police, the fire chief, they would stop the show. And if we were in a theater, the curtain would come down and this, great big guy in a suit would come and shout, or you tap the microphone, "Are we on?" One of those, and shout, "You got to sit down. Everybody's got to sit down. You got to stay in your seats. You can't stand up. You got to stay down. Otherwise the band, we're pulling the plug," or whatever the expression was. The band can't go on. And everybody would sit down. The kids would walk back. And then the curtain would go up. Mick would come out and he'd start shouting, "Get out of your seats!" He'd wiggle his bum. He'd wiggle his bum at the audience, and they'd all go apeshit and rush the stage. And then it would happen again. So some shows just never got off. And you've got to remember, the Stones only did 40 minutes. If they did a full show, it was only 40 minutes. It was only about 12 songs. It might not have even been 40 minutes, to be honest. But a lot of shows just never finished. And the fans, the audience went crazy for them. And, were encouraged. Mick was a marvelous performer, even in these early days. I mean, he really knew how to drive them wild. And they just, and then the local chapter of the fan club, if we were in a big city and there was a local chapter, then the local chapter of the fan club would be allowed in by the local promoter, and they might have decorated the room, and there might be a few fans or the promoter's kids, or, there'd be some huge angel cake with "I Love Brian" on it, or, party invites and telephone numbers, a lot of telephone numbers. Not that, I don't know what one would have done with the telephone number, because, I don't know how. I guess they were their home's telephone number. Anyway, I don't know what you would have done. But, and it was sort of pre-panties being thrown up. They hadn't quite got to that. There were a lot of sweets dolls were thrown up with messages. "I love you," third row stalls or something. It was sort of sweet and innocent and naive and pathetic in many ways. But it was terribly exciting to be part of because it was so new. And, it was a great thrill to do it. I'm absolutely thrilled I did it. But
was there ever a point during that tour where you were a little fearful because of the craziness from fans?
Well, that's a good question, actually. Not really fearful. I mean, they never attacked me. They might, if they got up, they'd grab Mick or Brian, but they were, they didn't really get on stage that often, and they were grabbed quite quickly. And there used to be a room at the back that used to be sort of full of palpitating young girls, being calmed down by a nurse or something. I mean, some places they had it organized like that. I was slightly scared of the cops sometimes because, we didn't have passes. You didn't have a laminate. This was, these are long before those things happened. And a couple of times I think it was Washington, D.C., but I can't be sure. The show was stopped and a cop, a motorcycle policeman, got on the stage. And when it was stopped, I was in the audience photographing from the audience up into the stage. And I was also trying to photograph the audience when I could, not that I could very often. And I went back up on the stage. In those days, there were always steps from the stage into the auditorium. And I was climbing the steps, and this motorcycle cop, sort of basically said, "Not so fast, buddy, get back there." And I said, "Well, I'm with the band." And he said to me, something like, "Quit the fake limey accent" or something, and then fortunately, somebody either from the band or maybe Bob, the tour manager, said, he's with us, and the guy let me through. But I've got a photograph of this rather threatening armed motorcycle cop with his motorcycle helmet and the jodhpurs and the high boots and everything. And I remember feeling a little nervous just for a moment because, he had his hand on his baton. He might have just, I don't know, struck me. So but otherwise, no, I never felt, I was too young and it was crazy. I just loved all the craziness. If you ever see film of the Stones when the audience is going mad and people are running on the stage, often if you look at Brian, he's laughing. He's loving it. I mean, nobody likes being scratched or punched or, and the fans could be very aggressive, not really intentionally aggressive, just in their exuberance and their excitement of being close to their heroes. They could do some damage, those young girls. But generally, it was just wild. It was fun. It was exciting. It was an adventure. So no, I never. And occasionally, even I had my own little fans. Sometimes, they'd see me on stage and they'd wave to anybody if they thought that they might get to the Stones.
Right. Is this the image you're talking about with the motorcycle cop?
Oh yes, there you go. It's on my website. Yeah, absolutely. That is the image. That's the guy. So you can see he's menacing, and you can see in the background that's Bob. I think that's Bob Bonus, the tour manager, hustling a girl off backstage, and the Charlies, they're just about to stop, I think, or be made to stop. And certainly there's stuff going on. And this guy, this policeman, he was trying to get me to step off the stage.
That's a great photo.
Yes, but it's funny, isn't it? Thank you. Yes, I think it's a great photo, but I'm really pleased with it because it's caught the moment, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But nobody was interested in it at the time.
And it's funny how that happens sometimes. I mean, that just goes to show, just because you don't think it's pertinent at the time, you may later on in life, you may go back into your archives and look at something. I've done this as a photographer, and something I didn't think was all that, or at the moment, I go back and I go, oh, that's kind of interesting. That has some virtues about it. It caught a moment.
I do that all the time. Now I do that. In fact, I was doing it yesterday because I wanted to find some pictures for Instagram that were completely different from the music stuff, just to break the mood at Christmas and at New Year, just an image of something. And I was looking through some stuff that I'd shot, and I just looked at it again, and I thought, actually, that's a lovely picture. And yet I remember quite clearly feeling disappointed with it at the time. And I think one of the problems when you're a professional is that nothing is ever quite good enough. It's always a bit disappointing. You always think, I should have done better. I wish I'd done better. Someone else would have done better than me. And usually the thing that works, the thing that consolidates or confirms that you've done a good job is when a client turns around and says, I'm going to use that on the cover. And you think, oh, great, I did it. I got a great picture because he's using it. But if that picture was just ignored, I'd feel disappointed, And I often, it stayed with me throughout my career, really, is that, the most important thing was that the picture came out. Whenever you sent the film away to be processed, the first hurdle was, did it come out? And particularly in the days when I hadn't learned about clip tests on film and things like that. Have I got the exposure right? And I couldn't in the very early days, you couldn't change the processing times for color. It was a sort of fixed thing, or at least I didn't know how to do that. So I think that often going back, revisiting pictures, you can see them through fresh eyes. You can view them. I mean, I do it all the time. I do it with pictures that I'm looking at all the time. I'm looking at I might look at a print file that I printed 2 months ago, and I think, actually, I'm going to tweak that because I think it's it could be a bit punchier, or the whites could be a bit cleaner or something, and it would be a better picture. And funnily enough, I found Instagram has been very much like that. I've revisited my work. I call it remixing. I've remixed it for Instagram and bought something out of it that wasn't perhaps as apparent before. So this thing of going back to your work is really important, because so much of it at the time is disappointing for one reason or another.
Since we're talking about your archive, how many images do you think you have in your archive? Do you have an idea, or?
I have I don't have an idea of totals. I should do, but I simply don't. I have about 4,500 stones and eggs, I think. I have about 120 Hendrix images. I have about 500 Marianne Faithfull images. I have about the same Kate Bush. I have about the same Eurythmics. And then I have, hundreds and hundreds of images from the 60s of bands, some important like Traffic or Yardbirds or Free, and some, lost in time, artists who just never made it. So I don't know what the total is. I think probably somewhere in the region of maybe 50,000 negatives, probably, maybe more. I don't know. The thing is, you see, it's never mattered. It's never really mattered. It matters more now, but it never mattered. Somebody said to me the other day, which are my best sellers? A gallery I'm working with. So, well, what are your best sellers? And I said, well, the best sellers are the pictures that I've been selling for the longest. It's obvious, And when I started selling my pictures, I only put one Hendrix image in the first exhibition because I didn't think anybody would be that interested. So that image, which happened to be Smoking, the famous Hendrix Smoking, and Classic, the Hands on the Hips image in the military jacket. Those were the two, and that was it. And for years, those were the only two pictures of Hendrix that I ever showed. This is way, websites aren't really, you don't have a website. There's no Instagram, there's no social media, nothing like that. And so exhibitions were the way that you showed your work. And so it's only relatively recently that I've sort of delved into my Hendrix stuff. And there's loads of Stone stuff that's never been seen because, I took that picture of the cop on the stage, because it's part of the story. But there are hundreds of Stones live pictures that have never been seen. And I still discover them to this day because somebody asks me for a series, or did I do this, or have I got something like this? They might say, somebody said to me the other day that they wanted to see pictures of Brian. And so I revisited a lot of stuff and found quite a lot of pictures of Brian that I've never really done anything with, simply because there isn't the outlet to. I mean, even in a book, and I've done several Stones books, you can only really use 300 photographs or something, if that. So you have to not use 4,200.
The vast majority goes unused. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
You spoke to something earlier that I thought was kind of interesting. He talked about the whole clip test thing, and people in the digital age probably don't even know what that's about. But when you shot film, you had to be on the money. You had to be on your game. You have a little bit of fudge room, but it's nothing like digital these days. And film stock could vary from stock to stock, from production
batch
runs,
from batch to batch.
To batch. And you could, a lot of times people would do film they'd buy a whole brick of film and then they do a test to make sure that it was like truly, at that speed for their particular lighting setup and light meter and the whole gamut, right?
Oh, no, we did all the time, particularly from the 70s onwards, not in the 60s, but from the 70s onwards, but certainly from the late 70s anyway. Yeah, we used to have to go to Kodak in London to buy film in bulk. You couldn't buy it in bulk anywhere else. Camera shops tended not to sell film, and if they did, it was sold in an amateur format, single rolls. But we would buy, I can't remember how it was packed, probably a pack of 20 rolls of medium format and maybe 10 rolls of 35 mil. And you're absolutely right. And it's really interesting. You used to have to take a roll out, check the instructions, because there'd be a little, like it was medication, there'd be a little document folded up 30 times to get it into the box. And it would list, it would have those funny little diagrams, with the sun and recommended apertures and the sun and a stick figure and the shade, a cloud coming over the sun and all that. But it would also have supplementary instructions for that batch. And so you might find a batch of Tri-X, which should be 400, is actually 380 or 420. But that was more often with a sheet film, 5.4 and 10.8 sheet film, where every box had a batch number, and you used to go to Kodak and you used to buy a batch. And if they bought out 2 different batches, you'd have an argument with the guy that this is no use to me. This is for one job. The batch has to be consistent throughout the job. And then we would test a batch, find out exactly how it performed, what the color was, and we would do our corrections, send another test back, and then we were happy. And it was a laborious process. Thank God for assistance. It was a laborious process, and you had to make sure your lab was consistent, and all of that stuff. It's all part of being a professional, but of course that's all lost now.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it's good or bad, but it's lost. It's gone. And of course, people don't know about those things. And, why should they, really?
Yeah. I mean, it's not the time we live in anymore. But back in the day, if you didn't have your act together, you messed up a job, that could be really catastrophic.
Oh, yeah. It'd be a disaster. I mean, I have to say, we ran a really professional operation. I mean, professional for the time. And we had very, very few reshoots. We were right. We were on the money, as you say, but we did test. And we did have clip tests, and clip tests are when you can actually clip off the end of a film and have it processed separately. You lose a frame, even 2 frames sometimes, if the lab is being a bit generous about it. But you then, if you shoot a film with the same exposure, so you don't bracket, you don't do any mixed, so you shoot it with the same exposure, what you think is the optimum exposure for that setup. Then they clip off the end of the film, process it at normal, usually, and then you can adapt, you can push it. I used to push half a stop, almost everything, because I liked it being a bit warmer. But, you also then had to get into the world of correction filters, especially with large format film. Where it might say you've got to use, I can't remember what they were called, a 40A or a 10B or something, to correct it. So you'd have to test everything. And it was very technical. And for somebody who wasn't very technical, that was a real chore. I didn't like that very much, but we did it. We usually got it right. We had very few problems like that.
Yeah, it could be daunting. And you're right. It is technical, because the only time that you got feedback, and this was later on when Polaroid was readily available commercially to proof stuff, that was your proof. It's not like today where you can, shoot a frame on a digital camera and you have instant feedback. You'd shoot a Polaroid and then you'd have to wait, almost a minute, wait for it to come up. You'd look at it and then you'd assess it, maybe mark it up with a Sharpie, right? And tweak the little things and then do it all over again and see if you tweaked it to where it was satisfactory, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it was a very important tool, Polaroid. I can't remember when Polaroid came in. It obviously came in America earlier than it did here in the UK. But I think we were shooting Polaroids around the mid-70s, but I can't quite remember when we first started. It was very important because it gave, for the first time, your subject, particularly when you're working with an artist, a musician, your subject could see what you were seeing. You could explain what you were seeing. Now, up until then, trust was absolutely key. When Hendrix posed in my studio, he had no idea what I was seeing, no idea how I was seeing him. I had to communicate that, and he had to trust me. And that was a very important part of the process. And it was, everybody was in the same boat. It was just, that was what you did. And the other thing to remember when you're photographing what I call real people is that most people, possibly not anymore, but in those days didn't like having their picture taken. That's changed completely. Of course, everybody now is so obsessed with how they look. The fact that they're obsessed with how they look reversed is another story. But in those days, the majority of people didn't really like having their picture taken because there was no real feedback. So communicating, trying to explain what you were trying to do was really, cumbersome, and trust was a really important thing. People had to trust you, and you had to share with them how your vision and explain it. When Polaroid came in, you still had to do that. You still had to establish trust, but you could show them what the camera was seeing. Now, the problem with Polaroid, I'm sure you'll bear me out in this, is that Polaroid had its own, idiosyncrasies. Polaroid wasn't always consistent. Polaroid color wasn't always consistent. So you needed experience, to know, to read your Polaroid. It was hugely helpful with composition. It was hugely helpful to be able to talk to somebody about their presence in a frame. But in many ways, and I hated it when people took the Polaroid. I used to really put my foot down and try and stop people taking the Polaroid, because I think quite a few sessions were disappointed people because of the Polaroid, because your subject, if you were photographing somebody, but the ultimate client, say the management, wasn't there, and they took a Polaroid, an early Polaroid, with them to tell the manager, show the manager. If the manager didn't like the Polaroid, he was set against the session, regardless of how great the session was. So I hated people taking the Polaroids. And I used to get, quite bad-tempered about it, and quite demanding, a bit prima donna-ish about it. But I really hated it. And I did feel on 2 or 3 occasions that people had prejudged the session on the strength of an early Polaroid. And with people like Kate Bush, for instance, who was incredibly energetic and frenetic and full of ideas, if she saw a Polaroid that she didn't think worked, she would want to move on. And I'd say to her, no, hold on, I think we can make this work. It's like a demo. I used to say to musicians, the Polaroid is like a demo. It's not the finished song. It's the bare bones. Let's work on it, because I think this is going to be really good. And I can do things. I can tweak the lighting. I can change this. Let's do another. And so the Polaroid was a huge, huge help, huge, important asset. Whereas nowadays, I hate it. I mean, I don't shoot very much anymore. And I don't shoot what's called tethered, where the camera is tethered directly to a computer monitor. I don't do that. I will not do that, because every frame you take, everybody in the studio rushes to the monitor, including often the subject, and it breaks the rhythm. It breaks the process. So I have got this thing, which I call, I've got to get this right, I call analog pace in a digital space. So what I do is I shoot 12 exposures, and then I stop. 12 was on a roll of medium format film, because I can set up a rhythm with the subject. The subject can set up a rhythm with the camera. You don't have the bloody makeup artist or the stylist or the wardrobe person fiddling and fussing about bloody jacket, when actually the most important thing is the artist. Not what they're wearing. It's the artist and how the artist comes across in a portrait. The artist is the hero. If it's not, it's not a bloody jacket. It's not a makeup job. All these things should be subservient to the artist, and you shouldn't see them anyway. And if everybody's fussing about the bloody makeup all the time and fiddling, then the artist has no chance. And so I don't like that. I don't allow that. I really don't allow that. And it's a jolly good job that I don't shoot that often, because, I think I'd have a real battle on my hands these days, but I won't allow it. When I do shoot, as I say, I shoot 12 shots, boom, and then we move to another setup, or I might shoot another 12. But it's that medium format rhythm, and it's a relationship thing, and you get things, and it's all about repeating tiny changes, The other thing of going back to Polaroid, I'm sorry, I am going on, I realize that, but going back to Polaroid allows you to get rid of a lot of the crap before you start shooting. It allows you to do a lot of pre-editing. And one of the things that I tend to do, or used to do, is I didn't give people a huge number of choices. We'd make decisions. I tended to shoot in the studio on a tripod. I lock off things. I like, and then I'm concentrating and focusing on the performance. And it is a performance, whatever, the subject says. They're performing for the camera, even those, ridiculous artists who say, I don't want to pose, man. I don't pose. You know, it has to be natural. It's not going to be fucking natural. You're in a studio and I'm a photographer. It's not natural. We have to make it look natural. But it's a job of work and you have to do it, you know.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much little nuance that's going on between you and the subject. And I'm glad you spoke to that, because in the age of digital, a lot of people are not in that flow. You know, the Polaroid allowed you, and I can see why you wanted control over who got a hold of that Polaroid, especially the early ones, because that could, you know, it's just a test shot. Like, that's not the end result. You know what you're going to get, but other people that see it and don't get it and don't understand photography, they can totally misconstrue it and or write it off as, oh, this is terrible, I don't like this, or what have you. Right?
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. And it's made me think of something else as well about composition, is that in the beginning, you know, I used to put a bit of bleed around my subjects because I used to think that was important. And then I realized that magazines and even record covers, they weren't cropping the picture properly. And so I realized that I had to do all of that. I realized very early on I had to crop the picture completely and worry about what was on the edges. I couldn't count on my client doing it properly, so I had to do it. And I learned that very early on. And the other thing that was extraordinary was that in the early days, a Marianne Faithfull picture, the pub picture, they wouldn't use the one I love, the one that I use, the one that's on my website, where you can see the guys looking at her and they're reflected in the mirror behind her, which I think is I'm really proud of that photograph. But Decca Records wouldn't use that because they thought that the guys, it was too suggestive. There was something sexual about it. Well, of course, there's something sexual about Marianne, whatever she did, but that was too much. So they used another shot. And in the other shot, which is by a beautiful Victorian etched window, and it's a lovely picture, and she's got her legs underneath her sitting on a velvet seat. But in the background, behind her, there was some pipes. They were actually old gas pipes, believe it or not, from when they had gas lighting. But they were painted to look a bit like the timber paneling, that they were had a sort of dirty brown paint on them to try and blend them in. So when Decca Studios, yeah, absolutely. So you see that we're looking at this picture. You see that vertical space, that dark vertical space. Well, within that space, there are some pipes. Well, on the record cover, somebody at Decca has retouched the pipes so that they read. They've actually retouched the pipes because they couldn't or wouldn't or didn't think one wanted a dark black space in the picture. You know, I mean, they would retouch it. And that sort of thing just used to drive me mad. So when I realized that they might do that, I had to do everything I could to make sure that the picture was how I wanted it to appear, and hope that, you know, it would survive the input of the, you know, firstly the management, then the record company, and then the designer, and finally the bloody printer. You know, that something, the essence of the picture would come through, in spite of being printed on the worst cardboard achievers.
That's a really important thing that you said, because I think a lot of photographers, at least starting out, don't realize, and they have to learn this for themselves. But if you have something that you want to see in print, or that you want the client to accept, you give them what you want. Don't give them a lot of choices, because inevitably they'll always pick the one that you don't like. If you put stuff that you don't care for, they'll choose one of the ones you don't care for. It seems like you want to give them what you would like to see and what you would hope that they would pick, right? You kind of have to lead them down that path.
Yes. And if you've done your job properly, if you've treated the artist with respect, if you've being creative without being overbearing, if you've concerned yourself with all the practical logistics that a record cover or whatever it is needs. So if you're doing a magazine cover, you've got to make sure there's enough space for the logo of the magazine. You don't want them putting it on your subject's forehead. You want to make sure that there's room for the logo, room for the record company. But once you've done all of that, you've got to edit it so that you give your client a choice, but that choice is within what your vision was. If you just give them all access to everything, and we did this in the early days because we didn't know any better, but if you gave them access to everything, they would choose the wrong bloody picture. It was almost a foregone conclusion because they don't know. They really don't know. Andrew Loog Oldham was a real exception in this. He was a visionary. He understood. He had a tremendous sense of image. He was a real visionary, but an awful lot of them weren't. I mean, I did a Slade cover, and Chas Chandler, who was the bass player in a group called The Animals, and he went on to manage Hendrix. And then I started working with him when he managed Hendrix, and I went on to work with him with a lot of other artists, including Slade. And I did over 40 sessions with Slade. And I think I did nearly all their covers in the 70s. And Chas would never be there, never. He'd never come to a session. He'd always leave it to me and the band. And I remember we did an album cover for Nobody's Fools, the album that was called Nobody's Fools. And I gave them red noses, like clown noses. And I said to them, just pose as regular posing and don't pay any attention to the noses. And I shot it in black and white and color. And then I hand colored the noses red on the black and white. And I thought it was great because the band were looking fantastic. This was the joke. The band were looking at their very, very peak. Their relationships, their look, their style was absolutely fabulous. And the picture was super simple with just a white background. And their relationship, their pose was fantastic. And they had these red noses. And it was just a really lovely thing. And I said to Chas, I think this would be a great cover if you just, printed it black and white, but with the noses red. And but they wouldn't. They didn't think that it was right. They printed it in color and it looked awful. And it was a terrible disappointment to me. And, I should never, because I didn't think they were going to be so stupid, I should never have delivered the color. I should have just lost the color, But I didn't do that. I didn't have that confidence. I mean, where I draw the line in all of this is I think if you haven't understood your brief, if you don't understand what the artist is trying to say, if you don't understand what the music is trying to say or who they're communicating with, then you've blown the session. You've let everybody down. So assuming that you've got all those bits right, then you know where you're getting to, and you want to cut out as much of the rubbish as you can before you actually shoot film. And that's where Polaroid was wonderful. And that's where discussion is wonderful. And you can test with Polaroid. Somebody's got a terrible pair of trousers. Instead of saying to them, oh gosh, those are awful trousers, you take a photograph of them where the trousers look really awful and they'll see it for themselves. They'll say, oh God, those trousers don't work, do they? Probably not. Yeah, try something else. So you help them, you guide them, you hold their hand, you help them make the right decisions. And if you've done all of that, then, nobody's really going to argue with you. Now, I always remember somebody once said to me, I delivered a shoot, and they said to me, well, gosh, I think there's probably only one here. I said, well, how many covers are you expecting to do?
Right.
There's one. That's what you want.
That's all you need, right?
That's the cover. We got it. Great. Goodbye. Thank you so much. Here's my bill.
So when you photograph these bands, what was kind of the process for you as far as, did you get a pre-release of the album before it was released to the public? And did you listen to the music so you could kind of understand what the music was about? What went into that process? Or was it more discussion type stuff or a little bit of everything?
In the 60s, there was very little of that. In the 60s, things weren't conceptual, things weren't planned. When I shot what became December's Children Between Out of Our Heads, I didn't know whether that was going to be a cover. I just hoped it would. I shot it so that it would work as a cover. I was careful to shoot as much as I could that would work as a cover if they wanted it. But I was relying on Andrew because in those days, the management or the record company would look at existing pictures and say, well, that would make a good cover. That could be the next cover. It wasn't really until Between the Buttons in 66 that Between the Buttons was not a conceptual cover, but it was a session that I shot specifically to be a cover. And I shot quite a lot of stuff in the 20, 30 minutes that I had. And I shot everything in the hope that the idea, my concept, would produce something that Andrew could use as a cover. But it wasn't really until, I guess, maybe 73, 74, that covers were considered and conceptualized, even if it was just along the lines of, we need a picture of the band looking tough, or we need I want a real close-up of the singer, or whatever. And then in the sort of latter part of the 70s, there was a breed of designer, art director who would come up with heavily conceptualized covers, and you would get a brief, or you would work with them to create a brief. So, it would arrange. I mean, the album cover for Lionheart, for instance, for Kate Bush, the second album for Kate Bush, that came from a dream that I thought Kate had, but I believe it was her brother who had it originally, and he recounted it to her, of a girl, Kate, going up to the attic of an old house and finding an animal costume, or dressing up as an animal. That was it. That was the brief. That was the idea. And I art directed it. My assistant, Richard, who was a graphics designer as well, we did the whole thing. And I built the set in my studio, and we organized the costume. Having discussed it with Kate, we put it together ourselves, if you like, in the studio. And all the photographs, Kate's going through a range of poses, but all the photographs are pretty much exactly the same in terms of proportion, in terms of composition. No moving around. Everything has been honed down to what I think is the best. And I think that, that it definitely got better because the conceptualizing of an album cover came with me becoming a better technical photographer. In the 60s, I really didn't know. I don't think I could have fulfilled a brief. I took, we're looking at Kate Bush. So that's a set in my studio, and the costume we had made for her to match the lion's head, which I'd got in a fancy dress outfit, a rental place. And I would love to take the credit for making it a male lion, but I'm not sure whether that was entirely my idea. But giving Kate the sort of lion mane hairstyle, that was fantastic. And she looks wonderful in that, doesn't she? And I didn't want to do it in a real attic because of all the logistical problems. And I wanted to make sure that I had what looks like daylight. It's supposed to be a big dormer window. And I've got my light behind there emulating daylight.
It's a stunning photograph.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
Thank
I
you.
love the composition is beautiful.
Well, this goes back to this thing. She's quite small in the frame, and I know that EMI were concerned that she was quite small in the frame. But I said to them, but it's all you see. You're drawn to her. She is No, she's the hero in that picture, and everything is designed to make you see her. So I think that it's been considered. The angle, it's not arbitrary. We looked at it from lower, we looked at it from higher, but in the end, everything comes together. I sort of believe that usually there's one angle where everything falls into place. And part of my job is to find that angle before. I don't like the sort of throwing the shit against the wall and hoping it sticks approach, which is a digital approach now, really. Just shoot thousands of pictures. We've got to get one. We must get one. That's a terrible approach, I think. I'd rather shoot, a dozen pictures and know that I've got one, than 1,000 pictures hoping that I've got one. You can't really be sure. I mean, of course, I am a studio photographer, as I've made it quite clear. I mean, I'm not a reportage photographer. And if you spoke to the late Jim Marshall or Baron Wolman, they would have something else to say, I'm sure, about it. Particularly Jim Marshall would have had a lot to have said about it. Jim never really liked my very stylized pictures. For him, real photography was black and white, 35 millimeter reportage. And he was wonderful at it. But as I said before, earlier in this conversation, it didn't really work for me. And this does work for me. This sort of approach does work for me. And it's something that I have an affinity with musicians, not that I can play anything or sing anything, but I love musicians and I love music and I love trying to create images for them. And that's what I've tried to do.
I think the difference between, what they were doing and what you're doing here is you're really creating fine art as opposed to capturing a moment, which, is a skill in itself. But this is actually more of a fine art of photography. You're building a concept and then executing that.
Well, thank you. I think that's a very lovely way of putting it. And I think that, I've never seen it as being fine art. But what I've always tried to do is I've always considered myself to be a commercial photographer who tries to be as creative and as artistic as I'm allowed to be, without ever taking away from the artist. For me, the artist, the subject is, you've got to see them first. And I never wanted people to look at my work and say, oh, that's a Mankowitz photograph of, who is that? I don't want that. I want people to look at that and say, gosh, that's the best picture of Marianne, Kate, Susie Quattro, an artist, American-born artist, a great artist, a pioneer artist, one of the great rock and roll women ever. I photographed her a lot, and I love working with her, and I love some of the pictures of her. And in every shot, doesn't matter whether she's big or small, every shot she just shines. And the band is like furniture. She's just lounging on them or against them. It's absolutely fantastic. But yes, so I want to be artistic. I want to be creative, but I want to make sure that you see the artist, not me, the artist.
Yeah. And I love Susie Quattro. I fell in love with her in the 70s. And her and Kate Bush. Oh my God, that was another. I mean,
yes. Well, what's not to like?
Right.
Great looking women, wonderful artists. Extraordinary talents and fantastic music. It's pretty good mix.
Yeah.
I love what you just said and elaborated on, because you want to be creative, but it's really about that artist. You want to try to pull the essence. You want people that view it to see that artist and pull out the essence of who that person is, and if you've done your job, it resonates with people when they do see that, right?
This is so important. This is the key to it. It's what I realized when I was 16, 17. I realized that's what I wanted to do. I couldn't have perhaps verbalized it or considered it intellectually. I just knew that that's what I wanted to do, and that's what I've been working to do. It's thrilling when it works, you know, when you get a great picture of somebody that just somehow captures their essence, when you've managed to get them to give you that. It's absolutely thrilling. And this is one of the reasons why I was so keen to make, you know, the television series, Icon, Music Through the Lens, which you can, as you guys know, is on PBS Amazon. And I mean, if you, PBS, I think you can download it with PBS, but it's also on their Amazon channel. And I wanted to celebrate music photography in all its forms, not just in the area that I work in, but, you know, from Baron and Jim Marshall right up to, you know, Pune Ghana and many others, loads and loads of people. My memory is so bad, I can't remember everybody's name. But, you know, we wanted to celebrate music photography. And you know, we did, I think, 300 interviews altogether for this, you know, with, I think, about 150 photographers and about 150 different artists about music photography in all its forms, every single thing. And, you know, we boiled that down to 6 hours of really riveting television that gives you an incredible insight into music photography. And it's very important because every music lover who has bought albums has a music icon in their collection. You know, music covers, album covers back in the day were so important. They were so much part of the experience. I know they aren't anymore. But, you know, image is still really important. Just look at Instagram.
Yeah. Yeah. I still like physical music. I love CD. I have CDs, vinyl, cassette tapes. But yeah, that was part of the whole experience of going to the record store and flipping through the bins, the records in the bins, and looking at the artwork. I mean, it was art. You know, you were holding art in your hands. And then, you know, and then actually listening to the music and reading the liner notes, and that whole thing came into the whole musical experience. It's what we grew up on, you know.
It was crucial. But you see, we've lost sight. Listen, you know, I think Spotify might not be great for artists, but it's great for listening to music if you suddenly want to hear something that you haven't heard for ages, or an artist who you don't know, or whatever. It's fantastic. Might not be good for artists, I say again, you know, and don't want to defend it in any way. So, I mean, the modern times have lots of great things, but people have forgotten that albums used to be expensive. And when you're young, you don't have a lot of you have disposable income, hopefully, but you don't have a lot of it. So you choose carefully which album you're going to buy. And you buy an album, you take it home and you play it, and it's a precious thing. It's special. And the cover that it's in is part of that experience. You put it on, and you're careful with it, and you put the needle on, and you sit down and you look at the cover and the music starts. It's part of it. It's part of that marvelous experience of listening to music. And it's really good. And then, you know, when they started printing lyrics, you could read lyrics or read a bit more, or get some extraordinary pretentious essay by some, you know, pretentious heavy metal band or whatever it was. It was part of the great experience of it. And then, you know, the covers made great. You could roll joints on the covers. It was terrific. You know, it was all part of the whole experience. And being part of that, you know, having... one of the great pleasures for me is, particularly now with social media, is that I can, every month, you know, we put up whatever it is, 25 images on Instagram. And we repeat images that are very popular, but I always put in images of bands that people haven't heard of or don't know very well. And they don't get lots of likes. That's not the point. But it's nice to share an image that people might not know. And so often I get messages saying, I never realized you did that. That cover was so important to me. I had that on my wall when I was a kid. That changed my life, you know. And you think, wow, isn't that wonderful? You know, isn't that absolutely marvelous? That is magical to think that, you know, that person, without knowing who I was, what had gone into making that picture, loved it so much and felt so strongly about it that it moved them to put it up on their wall. to be part of that. And this is what's so great now, is that although I'm dealing with pictures that I've taken years and years ago, I'm getting all this feedback. I'm remixing the stuff for social media and getting all this wonderful feedback. And it's really very exciting. So here we are. It's an analog pace in a digital space.
I love that.
That's so beautiful. I mean, that's the highest compliment, right? To know that you were part of somebody's life. You don't even know these people, but you've affected them because that piece of time, that album or what have you, was such a big thing for them that they're like, oh my gosh, thank you.
Yes. And that's lovely. I mean, that's incredibly rewarding and fulfilling, and it brings me great joy. I'm really thrilled about that because, so often, the artist doesn't say thank you. The artist takes it for granted, or the record company certainly doesn't say thank you. And, so especially this day and age where loyalty means very little, I think, to be able to share things like that and to get feedback, and particularly that sort of feedback is an absolute joy and gives me an enormous pleasure, which is really one of the reasons why, of course, one does it. You want people to see it. And I want people to see the work that isn't as well known. I mean, I want to, and I have to put up well-known work, but I always try every month. I try and put in 2 or 3 pictures that I know people won't have seen, and they always get fantastic feedback. I mean, Slade, for instance, don't get lots of likes. Well, they don't get as much likes as Jimmy or the Stones or Kate, but they get lots of likes, but they get huge reactions because the Slade fans out there who see it love it, and they love sharing their thoughts and talking about it. So it's fantastic stuff, great feedback.
That whole experience of looking at album artwork was pivotal into my introduction to rock and roll, because I didn't have older siblings. I had, friends that had older siblings, and I would hear some of their music. But for me, it was discovering it on my own. And the way I, previous to me discovering rock and roll, because my parents really didn't listen to a lot of rock and roll, the typical stuff like Elvis Presley. There might have been a Jimi Hendrix album in there, but for the most part, it wasn't rock and roll. And so my experience was, I'm walking around my junior high school and I see this kid with a Rush shirt on, and I go, wow, that's really weird. And it was the Starman on the front of his shirt. And then later on that week, I'm walking around, I see the same kid again, and he's got a Rush shirt on, but it's the Moving Pictures album on his t-shirt. And I was thinking to myself, oh man, that is so like weird. And I didn't have the words for it at the time, but abstract and just kind of bizarre. I got to know what that's about. And I literally went to my local record store in Fairbanks, Alaska, found that album and bought it. I had no idea about anything about Rush. Took it home, put it on my turntable, and it's literally like in the movies where everything is black and white. And then as that needle hit, yes, it's like Technicolor. And I was like, oh my God, this is what it's all about. This is rock and roll right here.
Yeah. I'll never, ever get used to the idea that something that I shot 45, 50 years ago had that sort of effect on people. And it's so thrilling. And yet, I don't want to take it for granted. I just, it's just an extraordinary thing to find at this stage in my life, at this stage in my career, that these pictures have that extraordinary life and energy still, that they mean something. The music of your formative years, Rush, will always mean something to you, always. The music of our formative years will always stay with us. And I was very fortunate. For about 3 decades, I was able to work with enough formative artists, even in the 80s, I did ABC and their Lexicon of Love, which was the biggest album of the year, And when people realize that I did that, they go, oh my God, I never realized you did that. No idea. Well, that's good, because it had nothing, me doing that had nothing to do with the music. It just was, we did a great cover, and you love the album and you're drawn by the cover, but that's great. It's a great thrill and a great joy, and I'm really pleased to have been part of hope a few generations' formative years.
Definitely. I look at all the, you scroll through your website and look at all the different galleries, and you have it broken up in the different decades, some of it. Yeah. And it's amazing how many albums were part of my youth that you shot the cover for.
Isn't that good?
Yeah. It's fantastic.
No, it is great. It's great for me. It's great to know that. You see, the thing is that I was one of the very few photographers to consistently stay with music, even if I was I had a big commercial advertising career from 80 onwards, but I always did music. I never stopped doing music. And I music gave me huge pleasure and delight, and I loved the challenge of it. And my approach had results. I got great results, which is why, up until about 2000, I was so busy. And so it's been a joy. I've loved it. And I consider myself extremely lucky that I was able to find photography so early and pursue a career that's, given me 60 years of joy.
Yeah.
60 years of joy. That's my next t-shirt. That will definitely be my next t-shirt.
That should be a t-shirt. Hello, it's Todd Pearson. Happy fall to everyone. Wes and I want to acknowledge our media sponsor, New Magazine. That's NUE. You can follow both the national and the Denver edition of New Magazine on their Instagrams. The national edition can be found at new_magazine and the Denver edition at new_Denver_magazine. Look to New for compelling stories from the world of art and fashion. Thanks for listening.
I'm Gered Mankowitz, and you're listening to the Tenant Broadcast. Enjoy.
Hey, I want to talk about the Stones album cover. I remember seeing this because I'm a huge Rolling Stones fan. And in the 80s, the Stones weren't that big. They were big, but only to a certain crowd. The 80s, new wave and punk was big. And the whole MTV era, I was one of the few people I knew that really was into the Stones of my age group at that time. I remember looking at this cover and thinking, man, this just really kind of captures the feel of the Rolling Stones to me. Mm-hmm. Talk about this session that you did. This is for the Between the Buttons, right?
Yeah. Yes. And this is called Smiling Buttons. This particular frame is called Smiling Buttons. So in those days, we're talking 66. So the Stones used to record through the night, used to start at about 10 in the evening, used to finish at 5 or 6 in the morning, depending upon how the session had gone. And I used to go and hang out. I'd shoot the recording, or I'd just hang out. And then one morning, we've all sort of tumbled out of the studio, and everybody's stoned and hungover and exhausted and hopefully happy because they recorded some good stuff. We were on the pavement waiting, I guess, for transport. And I looked at them in this early morning light, and I just thought, I said to Andrew, they just look just like the Stones should look. Everything about this moment, it epitomizes, encapsulates what the Stones look like. And everybody agreed. And so we agreed, whether it was the next morning or the morning after that, I don't know, that we would go and shoot a session. And that's what we did. So they'd been recording. They'd obviously bought some different clothes along with them, I guess, for the photography. And we piled into cars outside the studio. And we drove to Primrose Hill. Now, Primrose Hill is part of Regent's Park, really, in North London. Big, big park, but it's very, very high up. It's one of the highest points in London. And, I just thought, well, if we're high up, we're likely to get better light early in the morning. It was cold. It was dry. I think it was November-ish. And I'd been experimenting with this filter that was basically glass over the front of the camera with black card to create a bit of a vignette and Vaseline smeared in a circular way to try and isolate the band and blur the edges so that they're dissolving into the environment, into the atmosphere. And I'd invented sounds too highfalutin. I'd come up with this idea for shooting a series of portraits in the recording studio, because one of the problems about shooting the recording studio is there's a lot of visual interference. There's lots of vertical and horizontal lines. There's lots of bits of equipment. It's not really designed to be photogenic. It's designed to record music. And so, and also you're not photographing the whole band. The chances of photographing all 5 of the band together in the recording studio are virtually nil. So you're shooting individual portraits generally. And I wanted to find a way of isolating them from this environment. And so I thought about this filter, and I'd begun to experiment with it. I was really pleased with how it was shaping up. And I thought that if Andrew liked the recording studio pictures, then we would use it for the cover. And that's what I was shooting. I didn't shoot any other stuff. I just shot with this filter. And I discovered that if you can smear the Vaseline in slightly different ways and it would do slightly different things. And that was it. And I knew that I had, I don't know, maybe 30 good minutes, maybe 45 minutes in total, before they would become too tired, just overall anxiety. They would get ratty, they'd get pissed off at me, irritated by having to do more, cold, So they embraced everything. They posed, they were great. They were absolutely great. I was very worried about Brian because he had this big fur coat that had a big, deep collar. And he's sort of hiding behind the collar and turning his back to the camera. And I was very worried about it. And I turned to Andrew and I said to him quietly and discreetly, I said, I'm really worried that Brian is fucking this shoot up. And Andrew was absolute genius, because he just said to me, it doesn't matter what Brian does. He can only enhance the Rolling Stones image. So don't give it a second thought. And he freed me to just shoot and not worry about Brian. And he was absolutely right. And the actual image that was used as the cover is lost. That was lost at the time, because back in those days, people reproduced from the original transparency, and the printer never returned the transparency to me. And so that picture was lost forever, and probably destroyed or just thrown away with the original artwork, who knows. But I've got about 20 outtakes from the session, and they're all good, they're all interesting. And this one, Smiling Buttons, I proposed to the publisher Taschen when a few years back, they did a huge book on the Rolling Stones, a sort of official Rolling Stones biography, visual biography. And I suggested this might work as a cover, and everybody agreed. So this was the cover of the book. And that's pretty much it.
Wow. That's amazing. And it's sad that the original was lost in the process of getting the album printed?
It happened a lot.
Really?
Oh yeah. I mean, very little color survives. Only one frame survives from the first session in '65, one color frame. And it's lovely, but it's the only one. All the rest of the color was lost. See, what happened was when I kept the bulk of the black and white, but I had to deliver the color. And I wasn't confident enough in the '60s to edit the stuff. You know, it was all part of a learning curve. And the idea was that the color would all be returned to me and that I would keep it, you know, because I was, as the photographer, I considered it to be mine, but it also, I presumably would have the right conditions in order to keep it. You know, I've kept all the black and white negatives for 60 years, so I would have been able to keep the color as well. But nobody wanted to duplicate transparencies. So the original transparencies were always used for reproduction. They were just cut up, handed to magazines, handed to record companies, and nobody bothered to police them because that picture had no life. Once it was published, it was gone. It was finished. Everybody wanted the next picture or the next session, the next look. Nobody in their right minds would have imagined that the Stones were going to survive 2 or 3 years, let alone the photography. You know, the photography was a moment. It was an instant. It was a fraction of a second. It was over and done with. Once it was published, it was gone. I didn't feel that way, so I kept everything that I could keep. But one of the reasons I kept all the black and white was because we earned a lot of our money from supplying prints. And when you shoot black and white negative, nobody does anything with the negative. You do something with the print. You make a print, and that's what they reproduce from. So we used to make our money, or a lot of our money, from supplying prints, and we kept the negatives. And that's one of the reasons why my archive is mainly black and white negatives. Because I looked after the next, but a lot of the original color was just lost, and including between the buttons.
And as happens a lot of times, in the moment, people aren't thinking about the history or the future looking back, right? They're just thinking, like you said, about this is a look, this is a moment right now, and then it's done, right? They were moving on.
Well, there's no historical context because nobody, as I say, nobody imagined that the Stones were going to be around, let alone that anybody would be interested in their image or their photography or whatever. The idea that people 40, 50 years hence would be interested in this stuff, it just wasn't. You know, Bill Wyman once said to me that he started collecting very early photographs and ticket stubs and invoices and bank statements and everything. He became the archivist to the band, but he originally did it because he wanted to put a book, a scrapbook together so that he could show his son, when his son was old enough, he could demonstrate to his son that there was more to his life than being a plumber, that he'd been in a band. And here I am, look, I was in a band. You know, you were a baby, but I was in a band. And they were called the Rolling Stones. What a silly name. So even Bill, who was part of this band, who was actually going through this day in, day out, never imagined that they were going to last very long. And we didn't. And I kept my negs. I kept them for years and years and years, getting in my way, mostly because with everything else that my dad did for me, he gave me some really important pieces of advice. He said, number one, always get your credit. Number two, never give away your copyright. And number three, don't throw anything away. And pretty much that's what I did,
That's really sage advice right there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's when I was 15, he told me these things. He said, and photograph as many beautiful women as you can, he said. But that was before I made the decision to be a music photographer. He was quite angry that I didn't become a fashion photographer because he always thought the models were so beautiful. Right. So he couldn't understand why I didn't want to photograph beautiful models.
So you mentioned something. I want to go back just a little bit. You mentioned something about keeping your copyright. I want to know how you feel in the recent few months. The Warhol Foundation has been sued by a photographer for repurposing an image that Warhol had used in his famous screen printing. So how do you feel about photographers, let's say, appropriating your images to do screen prints or anything like that? Where does that fall for you?
Okay, the Warhol, the Prince photograph, which is what you're talking about, it's a very complicated thing. That's a complicated thing, and I don't know whether I have an opinion on that because I don't fully understand the ins and outs of it. It's not straightforward. It's complicated. I've always considered that I own the copyright for my work. That's what I've always considered, regardless of whatever anyone else might say. I'm the author. I own the copyright. People have paid me for the rights to use it for a particular purpose, and that's that. And that's it. Nobody's ever argued with me about that, really, until relatively recently anyway. As far as we live in a time where copyright ownership have been completely undervalued and devalued and undermined. People think that because something's on my website that they can just copy it and do what they like with it. People have very little respect. And, it pisses me off when somebody posts on Instagram my picture without crediting me. And I'm beginning to get a bit of a reputation for picking them up on it. And I don't like that. I think that's just so disrespectful. Why would you do that? You're getting likes because of my picture of that artist. The least you can do is to acknowledge, my contribution to that experience. So that's important. I don't allow people to make silk screens because I do silk screens. I don't mean I do them myself, but I collaborate with silk screen artists. In fact, I'm just collaborating, and I am collaborating at the moment with a wonderful American silk screen artist called Walter Kanabe, who's based in Indianapolis. And we've had a lockdown experience. I've never met him. And we've become great friends, and I absolutely adore him. And we're making a series of silk screens, and it's a great experience. It's been an incredibly rewarding, creative, fulfilling, and enjoyable experience to do that. And I've done silk screens before and I've collaborated before. I've collaborated with a wonderful artist called Christian Furr. We created an entire exhibition called 45 RPM based on my photographs and recreating them, and then Christian painting on them and adding diamond dust and God knows what else to create marvelous images. And so I do that. I colorize my pictures, and I print them on metal and wood and fabric, and I do lots of different things with my work. So I don't want some bloke stealing my Jimi Hendrix picture and making a horrible silk screen and trying to sell it in some bloody gallery in Florida. I don't want that to happen, and I don't like it. And we try and police it as much as we can. But having said that, life is too short, and it's very, very negative, bad vibes, bad baggage to carry around. And so I don't like it. I do whatever I can about it, and then I just put it out of my head because I don't like carrying all that shit around. It's not good for me. And when you're old, when you're getting old, you just don't have room for that stuff. But, there used to be something called, I've suddenly forgotten, I've blanked. Talking about getting old, senior moment, I've blanked on it. Artist reference. There used to be a right called artist reference, which you buy, where an artist buys the right to copy a photograph and create a new illustration. It was something that was done a lot on book jackets, for instance, old paperback book jackets. And artist reference was a source of income for people. So it's a right. And I think that, it's terrible that people think that it's okay. And what the worst ones, now that you've got me on this little soapbox, the worst ones are the ones who recreate your photograph, but say using pencil, and yet it looks exactly like the photograph. And then they turn around and say, well, it's my work. It's my work. And you think, well, you're jolly skilled with a pencil, but it's a copy of my work. And I don't like that. And I think it's wrong. And when people do ask me, particularly since I've been on Instagram, I do get the occasional Instagram from somebody saying, oh, I'd really love to make how would you feel if I made a painting? And I say, well, with all due respect, I'd rather you didn't. And some people send me their work. Somebody sent me the other day, and I don't mean send me the work, but they sent me a picture of it. They said, thought you'd like to see, my tribute to Jimi Hendrix. And I've got to write to them and say, I don't like to see it, to be honest. I don't think it's very good, and you've stolen my photograph. Take it down. Yeah, it's obvious to me. It's not the right thing. You shouldn't do it. People shouldn't do it. I don't mind people looking at my work and coming up with something new, but I don't like people copying it and calling it original. I think that's, just move on. Let's move on.
Right. But we do talk about, art appropriation a lot on this podcast, because you have such iconic images of musicians that I wanted to at least address that so people are aware and get a different perspective, because I think it's important. No, I'm really pleased you asked me, and I'm very happy to talk about it, of course, but I just don't want to seem like a sort of embittered, old bloke going, you can't copy my pictures. I love people liking my pictures. And I do say to people, look, it's very complimentary, but you're using this picture of Jimi Hendrix because it's one of the most famous pictures of Jimi Hendrix ever taken. And I took it. And that ought to mean something to you before you appropriate it and call it your own. It's not right. Yeah.
People don't begin to understand that now.
They don't. They feel like everything is public, domain, and they can do whatever the heck they want with it, right?
Yeah.
I've sort of, I don't like. There are photographers who will be nameless who put horrible watermarks on their work. And I understand why they do it, but what's the point of showing a beautiful photograph if you've watermarked it and it looks horrible? I know you don't want somebody to copy it. I understand that. Of course, I understand. It's obvious, But I don't want to put my work up unless it looks really good. And it doesn't look really good if I put, copyright Gered Mankowitz all over it, even if it's relatively subtle. So I just hope that people understand, and most people do, and a few people don't. And if we know about it, then we get it taken down, and we sue people. We do that, but I don't really like it. I don't like thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you addressing it. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
I know you've talked a lot about this Jimi Hendrix image, but I kind of want you to talk about it with us a little bit, as far as when you initially took it, you didn't know at the time or that it was going to become such an iconic image. Is that correct?
No, I have no idea. So I'll give you a bit of background, Ben. So I knew Chas Chandler, who was, as I said earlier, bass player with the Animals, and he discovered Jimmy in New York, and there's lots of mythology and different stories about that. But Chas brings Jimmy to London, and they put the experience together, and Chas shows Jimmy off to the music business and the British music press at a little gig they set up in a horrid little club called the Bag of Nails, which was in Soho, in a street called Kingly Street, which is parallel to Carnaby Street. And I get a call. I want you to come down and see this guy. He's absolutely phenomenal. You're going to love him. You're going to want to photograph him, blah, blah, blah. So I go to this club and it's packed. And there's this incredible cacophony of music and noise. And it's just, wow, what is that? What's going on? And I catch a glimpse of the wildest guy I've ever seen playing guitar, like a madman, possessed. I mean, I've never seen anybody play like that. And everybody there was mesmerized. And it was full of musicians. I mean, there's Clapton's there and Jeff Beck's there and the Pete Townsend is there and God knows who else is there. And they're all blown away by this chap. And then it stops and Chaz takes Jimmy around to introduce him to various people. And he introduces him to me. And Jimmy calls me sir, which felt completely ridiculous. And we just say, I really look forward to seeing you in my studio. And he goes, that would be great. And then he's hustled off somewhere else. And that was that. And for various reasons, I didn't get my session with Jimmy until 1967, until a few months later. I'm not quite sure why. I think one of the reasons was that they decided that they'd send a band to Europe to try and fine-tune the music, to put an act together, to get to know each other a little bit better. I don't know. But he came to me and I made this ridiculous decision now, thinking about it, that I would only photograph him in black and white. And the reason for that was that I wanted to treat him like a really serious musician. I wanted to treat him with dignity. I wanted to treat him with respect. I didn't want to make a pop picture of him. I wanted to create a series of serious portraits. And for me, at that moment in time, black and white was the format for a serious portrait. It was the proper format. And so I didn't shoot color. I didn't cover it in color, which was, really poor of me. But I didn't. And I think that my motives, and I think were absolutely genuine, and I think 100%. And it was just professionally naive of me not to shoot color. But he wasn't even a success at this moment. Hey Joe was either about to be released or was just about to be a hit, he was at the brink of his stardom at this moment. And I just did a series of portraits of him and the guys. And this picture against the white background is the only frame just like this. And I cropped it like this with just below his hands and through the top of his hair, because I wanted all the focus to be on his eyes and his presence. I hope it stunned me at the time and I felt confident enough to move on, because I only took this one frame like this. The rest of the roll, there's other stuff of him and the band, and there's one other frame which I call Classic 2. And then I delivered everything, and Chaz seemed really happy with what I'd done, but the record company didn't like it. They wanted color, and they did a session with somebody else. And then about a month later, 6 weeks later, Chaz calls me and he says, I want you to do another session just with the band, not with Jimmy by himself. I've got plenty of those, just with the band. I said, well, why? He said, well, because Mitch and Noel have permed their hair to look more like Jimmy. They'd given themselves afros to look more like Jimmy, and Jimmy had tidied his hair up quite a lot. And so I did a session just of the three of them together. I didn't shoot any more solos at the second session. And that was it. I didn't do any color at the second session, so I was consistent. I was consistently stupid. But anyway, Chaz seemed very happy with both my decision to shoot black and white and with the work. But the work wasn't widely seen because the record company, Polydor, well, Track Records first and then Polydor, they wanted color. And for some reason, they didn't come back to me for another session in color. And I didn't really give it much thought. I mean, I thought it was a bit of a disaster, really. I mean, the pictures weren't properly used. They were used a bit in press, and that was that. And then the record cover came up, which personally I didn't think very much of. And then Carl Ferris's famous fisheye infrared image came up, which I thought was terribly gimmicky. I mean, I think now it's extremely appropriate for its time, but at that moment in time, I thought it was I didn't like fisheye and I didn't like infrared. It was too gimmicky for me. So, and then I can't remember the chronology, but I never shot him again. I never got the chance. And I bumped into him a few times at some of the clubs that we all went to because, it was a very small scene and there were probably only a dozen places in London where everybody went. And so paths were crossed and he was always incredibly friendly. And we'd have a drink, we'd, check out the ladies in the room and talk about whatever and then move on. And looking back, I think what's really important about my session with him, apart from the fact that I did it in black and white and wanted to treat him seriously, was that he was at this marvelous moment. With hindsight, I can see it now. It was a most fantastic moment in his life. He was being taken seriously. He had completely escaped the prejudices of America, which were terrible for a black musician, for black people, but for a black musician at that time. He'd escaped the Chitling circuit. He was on the brink of something absolutely fantastic. He was writing his own stuff. He was recording stuff. It was absolutely a marvelous moment to have known him and to have worked with him. And the most exciting thing of all was that he gave me this extraordinary access. I mean, I'm looking at it now, and it's just like I'm looking at him. He's just letting me in. He's trusting me enough to let me in. And that's what resonates with my pictures of Jimi. That moment is this extraordinary moment, this calm confidence, this just looking, he never looked better. I mean, I'm sorry, but he never, ever looked better. The moment he started combing his hair, he didn't look better. That wild man look, that natural look, that the way, the combination of the military jacket, the scarves and everything, it just is absolutely perfect. And although, of course, he was an outstanding, extraordinary looking man, and he looked marvelous at various different points in his life, I don't think he ever looked as good. And I've had people actually just looking at my pictures and crying because they felt they were in touch with him. I don't know. It's extraordinary, the power of the picture. And it's fresh. I mean, I'm looking at it now. We're looking at it as we're talking to each other. And, it feels completely fresh to me. Ridiculous, isn't it?
It's well, and that's the proof in the pudding right there, is that, when it stands the test of time and it still resonates with people. I remember seeing this in some publication. It might have, this ran in Rolling Stone at one point, right? Have you licensed this to Rolling Stone at one point? Because this is where I feel like I've seen it.
Yeah, I tell you what, in 97, I think 97, Rolling Stone ran the smoking picture as the cover. And they asked me to tint it blue, which was very, innovative of them. And in those days, pre-digital, we had to make what's called a blue tone print, which is a chemical process, the printing process, and using horrible chemicals. And we made a series of blue tone prints, different strengths. And I sent the best 4 or 5 to Rolling Stone. They ran it as a cover. And I think he'd been voted the top guitarist of all time or something. I think it was 97. I really can't remember. And then this picture was used in various ways. And I did this coloration of this picture because we're looking at the Jimmy Classic color. And I did the coloration for the cover of my own book, the Mason's Yard Sessions book. But it's just, he's just looks great, doesn't he? He's just the most extraordinary looking. He's the most extraordinary looking man, and he was the most extraordinary musician, and everything just came together. But at the time, didn't do much, to be honest.
I love his pose in this, this hands on his hips. He's kind of looks like he's leaning forward, or at least it appears he's leaning forward, and his gaze just captures you. I mean, it's I can see why people cry when they look at this, because he feels like you can reach out and feel his soul. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, he's giving us, he's giving us that access.
What I love about this, and I remember seeing this in print, and I don't remember exactly where I saw it, and not the colorized version, but I remember just sitting there and looking at this photograph and just being mesmerized by it, just how raw and vulnerable, but also just how powerful this photograph is. I've literally spent a lot of time looking at this photograph, not knowing that you were the one behind this photograph, but this is by far the best photograph of Hendrix, hands down, that I've ever seen.
It's also probably one of the simplest. I mean, one of my objections to some of the other pictures that have been taken of him is that all the photographers tried to contribute something that they thought. Now, I know that I tried to contribute something to the Rolling Stones with my Between the Buttons thing, but that worked. And for me, Jimmy, the simplicity of this picture, so many of my portraits that I feel have lasted the best are incredibly simple, and what you were saying about he looks as though he's just leaning in towards you. Well, this is on a 50 millimeter on the Hasselblad, which is a wide angle lens, but it doesn't distort. Slightly exaggerates perspective, but you don't see any wide angle distortion in it. One of the things I used to explain to people was that if they lean into the lens, then it draws you into the picture. If you lean back, and I'm only talking about 2 or 3 inches, if you push yourself back, then it gives you the effect that you don't want to be photographed. It's like you're standing off it. So all you need to do is just lean in a little bit, and everything changes. And it's these simple, tiny little things that make a huge difference. And the thin line between a really great portrait and an ordinary portrait are these little things.
I love the choice of the 50 millimeter, which, if you don't know what that equates to in 35 millimeter, it's like a 35 millimeter lens, which, like you said, it's a wider angle lens, but it doesn't have the distortion. And you got to be really careful when you get, wider than a 35 millimeter, but it gives you that really interesting perspective when you're photographing, when you're doing it with a portrait.
Yeah. Well, the essence, he has all the pop star stuff. This makes a really good pop star, quite a big head, quite wide shoulders, and sort of no bum, no hips, that extraordinary shape. Brian Jones had it, Mick Jagger has it, that look. And the 50 mil just exaggerates that without you seeing what it's done. And that's this thing of not feeling the presence of the photographer, not feeling the presence of the camera. The camera is just the means by which the artist looks at you. shouldn't get in the way.
At what point did you kind of rediscover this whole series? When
It's funny, isn't it? I had my first exhibition in 1982, 81, I think, actually, 81. And it was the first ever exhibition of music photography in the UK. Nobody had ever shown it before. And took a huge amount of effort to get somebody to actually do it, because there was only one gallery in London that showed photography, only photography. Everything's changed so much in these 40 odd years. And I didn't put this in it. I put a cropped version of smoking, because I always loved the face on smoking. You know, that the smile, the crooked smile and the smoke coming out of his. And I thought it was much more interesting. So I cropped it really tight. There, that's smoking. So I cropped smoking because I just love that stone look. And, you know, he's not smoking a joint. He's smoking a regular cigarette. It's a Benson and Hedges gold leaf, if anybody is interested. So I thought if I crop it, you know, then, and you've got the exhale and you've got the stoned eyes and you've got that happy face, people will just think he's smoking a joint. And that's why I did it like that for the first ever exhibition. So, you know, I didn't really know what I had, and there wasn't a lot of interest. And the interest didn't really happen until 1992, when I had another solo exhibition. And I started showing a lot more of Hendrix, including what I call classic. And it was very, very popular. And I did it in 2 or 3 different forms, and it was very popular. And then I thought, well, this is really exciting. You know, that's great. And then in 95, I was beginning to work with digital post-production. And I got a call from a German record company saying that they were putting out a series of 4 Jimi Hendrix albums, and they wanted 4 color photographs. And I was about to say, I only shot him in black and white. I stopped myself and I said, oh, yes, that's fine. Great, I can do that. And I realized that I could colorize them and I could change them and make them contemporary. And so I did that. I did that for the German record company, and they were thrilled. They never questioned whether they were black and whites with color. They just loved them, and they made them 4 CDs. And then the next year, so I suddenly, my Jimmy world was opening up, my digital world was opening up. And then the next year, a friend of mine, a very dear friend called David Costa, who's a designer and art director who I work very closely with, he'd been doing some interesting silk screens. And he said to me, you know, I think we should do a silk screen of Jimmy. And so we did 2 silk screens of Jimmy, beautiful silk screens of Jimmy. And the same year, almost the same moment, a man called Alan Douglas, who was managing the Jimi Hendrix estate, looking after the Jimi Hendrix estate, calls me and he says, I'm putting together a Jimi Hendrix exhibition and I'd really love some of your photography. And what we're doing is we're taking photography and we're creating works of art. And I said, well, hold it right there, because I've just done that. And he went, what do you mean? He said, I've just done that. I'm just looking at the first silkscreen prints and we've just done it. And they're works of art and they're Jimmy and they're beautiful. And he said, I'd like to come and see them. And he came straight over. He was in London. He had an office in London, and he was in London a lot in those days. And he came over, and I put them up on the wall of the studio. And he came in and he looked, and he just stood there, and he just went, "Oh my God, this is my vision. I wanted to present Jimmy as a work of art." And up until that point, really, Jimmy was one of the most ripped off artists ever. You know, there were horrible albums, horrible images, horrible stuff. And Alan Douglas, a man who's no longer with us, but he was much disliked by a lot of people. But he just loved Jimmy and he loved the music. And he was trying genuinely hard to create a global image for Jimi, an official image. And part of that project was an album called The Ultimate Experience, which was a compilation. And he wanted to put our silkscreen on the compilation cover. And that's what he did. And that's what changed everything. Because it was at that time the most successful Jimi Hendrix album ever. And I've got somewhere in the back here, I've got my platinum disc, my Jimi Hendrix platinum disc. And, it was just a huge success. And then the exhibition was a success and my involvement with that. And then suddenly everybody saw my pictures as being the pictures of Jimi. And then that's it. And I haven't let them forget it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that is so cool. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Pleasure.
So you've worked with, do you know how many bands over the course of your career you've worked with?
I don't know. No, I don't know. I don't know because I've never really added it. I've got a list somewhere, but I just have never really added it up. I think there's probably about, I don't know, about 1,000 artists and over 500 album covers. And I don't know. And to be honest with you, it's never mattered.
Sure.
People say to me, oh, you photographed everybody. Well, of course I haven't. I photographed a tiny, tiny fraction of people, but the pictures that I've taken seem to be important of all the people that I've ever photographed. So whether it's the Jam or Kate or Susie or Eurythmics, or my pictures seem to be important pictures of those artists. And so people think that I photographed everybody, but I haven't. And I didn't pursue people. I never pursued anybody. I know photographers who have desperate to photograph Dylan. Well, I would have loved to have worked with Dylan, but honestly, he had to come to me first. I'm just no good at that. I really no good at. It might sound ridiculous, but I've never really. The only band I ever asked if I could photograph was Duran Duran. And that was for that 1981 exhibition because I wanted a tip for the top. I wanted my last picture to be a band who weren't successful yet. And I've always loved working with new artists anyway. So I rang somebody at EMI, a friend of mine at EMI. I said, who's the next big thing? And he went Spandau Ballet. And I said, oh, great. Well, give me the manager number. And I called the manager. And I said, this is Gered Mankowitz. I'm a photographer. I've got this exhibition and I'd like to. And the word came back, Spandau Ballet didn't want to be on the same wall as the Rolling Stones. So they refused me. So I went back to my friend and I said, Spandau Ballet don't want to work with me. Who's next? And he went, oh, Duran Duran are going to be big. So I called Duran Duran and they were thrilled to come and do it. And they came in and they were very friendly and I did a great session with them. And then I photographed them, I think 2 or 3 times actually. And they were my tip for the top. But I think they're the only band that I've ever actually approached and asked. And because I just never felt that if they didn't want me, I didn't want to be part of it. I never wanted to be an imposition. I never wanted to. That's why I'm no good at going backstage. That's why I never worked editorially, really. I never worked for the New Musical Express or the Melody Maker or like that, because I'm no good. If somebody asks me, would you go backstage and photograph so-and-so? The only artist I ever did that with was a guy called Billy Fury, who was a wonderful English artist, a sort of Elvis Presley, but he was a dangerous, sexy, wonderful, great artist. And we all loved him. He was one of those artists who I loved when I was a kid. And I got the chance to photograph him for a magazine and I had to do it backstage. And he kept me waiting in the corridor outside his dressing room for about an hour and a half, being very prima donna-y about everything. And I said to my assistant, if it wasn't Billy Fury, we'd be out of here now. But because it was Billy Fury, I had to hang on. And I got like 5 minutes with him. Oh. And a rather a good picture. And then he died about 6 weeks later or something. So,
oh, wow.
Well,
yeah.
I like that ideology that you weren't ever chasing anybody, because you're right. Like if if somebody wasn't into like doing a portrait session with you, then why push the matter? It's going to be more difficult to make it, to work in that scenario. And as glamorous as this all is, and people think it is, and it is glamorous, but I mean, you're working with bands that are famous, people that are famous, and sometimes that's really challenging. And if they're not in the right mind frame, and I'm sure you've experienced this, it can be a really challenging thing to do.
It can be very, very challenging and very difficult. And the thing is that I don't want to be there I don't want to photograph somebody in spite of them. If they don't want to work with me, I call it working with them. I don't photograph people, I work with them. I work with them to try and make an image, try and create an image that's right for them. If it doesn't work, if it's not right for them, then it's no good. It's a failure. It's a disaster. So I have to work with people, and I'm no good. And that's another reason why I like working with people early on in their career. When I heard Wuthering Heights, it hadn't been released. They said to me, listen to this. We need an image. We need a photograph, and that's an image. And I came up with an image, and that's how I like to work. But if the artist doesn't want to work with me, then, there's an English band called Catatonia. They had a marvelous singer called Sarah Kerris, and I photographed them, and I always thought that I always loved my picture of them. And I always thought it had a sort of a new take on the leader of the pack thing that I tried to do with Suzi Quatro and others. And then I learned relatively recently that they all hated my pictures. And I think it's so funny because, I always thought it was a really good picture. I've posted it a few times. We're telling the story. And I get lovely comments of people saying, it is a great picture. You will.
I saw your post about that band, and it's interesting because, sometimes you think that you've hit it out of the park. And you probably have, but for whatever reason, the group or whoever's you're photographing for whatever reason, they don't care for it. What do you do in those instances? I mean, you didn't know that at the time, but what do you do when you have that kind of a challenging scenario?
If I've got it wrong, and I have to say it hasn't happened that often. If I've got it wrong, then, hands up, my bad. I'll rethink it or whatever. I honestly can't think of that many sessions where things haven't gone right. I had somebody walk out of a session after the first setup because they felt that what I was doing was silly. And I thought I'd really caught something about the band. And I only got one or two setups with them. And then the lead singer, sort of stormed out. I made him call the record company first and say that he was leaving the session because he didn't like what I was doing. But, I still think the pictures are great. I publish the pictures. I put them in my exhibitions. I post them because, I think the pictures have caught something about the band, something that he didn't see at the time. Right? I think that very few, because people have to come to me, they come to my studio most of the time. So they make a commitment. They can make a commitment not just to me, but to having their photograph taken. And they usually come to my studio, mid-morning, which is early for most musicians. And they work through until 6 or 7 in the evening. Now that's quite a long stint. And I feed them and I look after them, but they're working. It's a job. And it's an important part of the business of being a musician, a success, having a really good image. It's something that you work at. And so it's a job of work, and I work with people, and it's a professional thing. And if they don't want to do it, then I don't want to work with them because I simply can't do it. So they make that commitment to me and they come to me. So they're on my turf and we then work together. I hold their hand, I do whatever I have to do. I've thought about it. I've discussed it with them beforehand, hopefully. And we then start working together. We make images, we create images, and hopefully they work. That's the idea.
Yeah.
It's a collaboration, right?
Yeah.
Always. And the very few times, I mean, I can think of a band that I thought they were the sort of England's answer to the Eagles. I thought they were and I always loved Henry Diltz's photographs of the Eagles. I think it was Henry Diltz.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, who did the sort of cowboy pictures. And I tried to do that with this band. I just misread it. I completely misread it. And they were lovely pictures, and they used the album cover that we did for them. But afterwards, I continued to work with them. Actually, I did a lot of work with them, and they turned around and said to me, we never really liked that session. It just wasn't us. And I just misread it. I thought I ended up by imposing something on them, which I never want to do. I didn't want to do. I thought I knew what they wanted to be, and I got it wrong. But it hasn't happened very often. It really hasn't happened very often.
Yeah.
Has there ever been a scenario or a difficult session where you didn't know if it was actually going to happen because of ego or whatever else may be going on, dynamics of the band or what have you?
Two things. Bing Crosby. I was booked to photograph an album cover for Bing. And there were 4 shots. The album was called The Seasons. And we were going to do 4 portraits, spring, summer, autumn, winter. And I was using a technique called front projection, which is where you project the background through a prism, and the camera and the projector are lined up exactly together. And so I had all my 4 background transparencies. I had everything set up. We bought 4 outfits for Bing from shops that Bing's management had told us Bing only gets his shoes here. He only gets his shirts here. He only gets his jackets here. Big star. And we had everything worked out. I had it worked out to a T. I had 4 lighting setups, all ready to go, all numbered. We could change over in 5 minutes from autumn to winter. And everybody was getting terribly worked up. The record company was getting terribly worked up, really uptight. And often in situations where you've got really big stars, it's the people around them that create the tension. Anyway, Bing arrives, and I have to welcome him. Nobody wants to step up. Of course, it's my session. I'm the photographer. I go and welcome him, and he's very cold, very, very cold. No smile, grim, and he's an old man. So I'm conscious of that. So he arrives, and he's on the way to the airport. I could tell almost instantly that he just wants to go. I didn't know why, just wants to go. So I take him into the dressing room. Would you like a cup of tea? Would you like a cup of coffee, glass of water, whatever? No. So I said, okay. So I said, these are the 4 outfits that we've got for you. And he went, no. I said, sorry? He said, no. He said, you're going to photograph me in this jacket and what I'm wearing? And that's it. So I said, but the album's called Seasons. And he said, I know what the album's called. It's my album. But I'm not going to dress up. So I thought, fuck, we're in big trouble. So I said, okay, fine. Thank you very much. So I'm looking at his outfit and I'm thinking, that's spring. That's as close to spring as I'm going to get. And so I rush into the studio and I just say, spring to my assistant, unplugging lights because we're probably set up for autumn or whatever it was. Anyway, spring, we're on spring, get the spring transparency. So I just announced to everybody, I said, Bing's not doing, Mr. Crosby's not doing anything. He just wants to be photographed in what he's wearing, which is spring. And he comes out, he sits down, and we managed to get 11 frames. And then he gets up, he goes, well, you got it. And he went. And so we got it. We got actually quite nice portrait, and they had to adapt. It's quite funny because if you look at the cover now, I just remembered this being on the front with the sort of spring background, and then the rest of the sleeves are just the backgrounds, representing the seasons, but there's no Bing. Anyway, and the tragedy, the two tragic twists to this story. The first one, and the most awful one, is that Bing died a couple of days later. So it was the last ever session that he did. Last album he ever released. He died on the golf course in Spain, which is where he was desperate to get to. But, and here's the other twist, is that what nobody told us, what nobody knew, what I didn't know, what Bing wasn't going to talk about, was that morning in the early hours at the Dorchester Hotel, he'd been robbed. Somebody had broken in his room and he disturbed them. So he'd been through this terrible experience. But nobody was talking about it. Nobody mentioned it. So we didn't know. So all we saw was this grumpy, unhelpful, miserable, unfriendly person who wouldn't do everything that we planned so painfully to put together, that we discussed at length with his management. Nobody had said anything to us about the robbery. Well, I didn't find that out until years later, when the producer, I was doing another project, and the producer of the album came in and he reminded me, he said, I met you when you did the Bing Crosby. And I went, oh gosh. And I said, what a miserable. He said, well, he was miserable because he'd been robbed in the early hours. He'd actually disturbed somebody robbing him, and he was very distressed. So that's that story. And the other story was Van Morrison, notoriously uncooperative person. And I get a call from a record company, say, would you like to photograph Van Morrison? I said, oh, yeah, I'd love to do it. No, would you like to do a cover for Van Morrison? Yeah, I'd love to do a cover for Van Morrison. Okay, he said, but here's the problem. Van Morrison doesn't want to see you. He doesn't want to know he's having his photograph taken. What can we do? So I said, well, okay, fine. Give me a chance and we'll think about it. I was working with the designer. So we came up with this idea that he was living in Ireland near Dublin. We found this fantastic beach that was like long, 2 miles long or something. And so I said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to put the longest lens we can find, and I'm going to hide in the dunes at the end of the beach. And he's going to come onto the beach at the far end, and all he's got to do is just to walk, looking out at the sea, throw a stone, pick up a shell, just walk. He'll never see me. He won't know he's having his picture taken. How about that? And everybody went, oh, gosh, that's great. That's going to be great. We can see it all. But he wouldn't do it. So I never did it. That's quite a good note to end on, isn't it?
That is a good note to end on. Funny story.
Before we sign off here, for people that want to check out what you have to offer, because on your website, you offer various prints, and then you've done something like five books. Is that correct?
Quite a few books.
More than that?
Yes, I think so. I haven't counted them. There are several books on the website that you can buy. There's the Jimi Hendrix book. There's my new-ish Rolling Stones at Home book, Going Home. And there's my retrospective, the soft-back version of my retrospective. You can buy all three on my shop. And there are some special offer prints, because I sell prints all the time. That's what I do, but generally through galleries. But I sell to private individuals if they inquire. But I also do special offers through the website and through social media. And I got 2 or 3 of those on the shop as well. So I've got quite a full shop. There's the silk screens prints are on there, and there's a lot on there actually. I mean, what I earn my living with these days is selling prints. That's how I earn my living.
And is most of what you do, though, is that through your galleries these days? Do you have a lot of gallery representation?
I do, because I started selling prints in galleries a long time ago. I've never had an exclusive relationship with one, because no one gallery was prepared to offer me that sort of security. if you like. So I've got, a lot of galleries. I think there are about 25 galleries across the world in various different countries that sell my work. Morrison Hotel Gallery is the main one in America, but San Francisco Art Exchange in San Francisco sell my work. And there are, several online galleries and other galleries. And there's a gallery in Nashville that has my work and things like that. So I sell through galleries, but increasingly, certainly since COVID, for the last 20 months or so, we've been selling increasingly online, indirectly and directly through, galleries that are selling online now and have been, and a lot of the work is sold online.
That must keep you pretty busy.
It keeps me pretty busy. It's not, it's not nonstop, but it is every week, every day. There's something to do, to follow up an inquiry or to fulfill an order or whatever. And I'm by myself. I don't have any, it's just me and here really. And there are 3 chairs in the office, but it's just me. It's just I have a chair for different jobs.
Oh. Gered, thank you so much for spending the time that you did with us today. That was very generous of you. We say it all the time. Time is the most precious thing that we have. And the fact that you were willing to spend this much time with us, that means the world to us. I can't thank you enough. And it's been an absolute honor and privilege to sit down and virtually talk with you today and hear about your history and some of your iconic images and hear your stories. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for being interested, and thanks for asking such, nice, interesting questions. And it's been a joy. I've really enjoyed myself. I'm afraid I like talking about myself. So it's not really a problem.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I mean, you've got some iconic images, and I've been scrolling through as we've been talking, and of artists I absolutely adore. So thank you so much for the work that you've done, because I think you've brought a lot of joy and happiness to a lot of people through your images.
Well, thank you guys. It's been really nice to hear and very complimentary, very flattering. And I've enjoyed it. And I hope that your huge listenership, if you can say that, enjoy it too. And, and enjoy the Instagram, enjoy the website. And, if you've got questions, people have got questions, they can write to me via the website. It's easy.
Fantastic. Again, the website is Mankowitz.com. And you can find Gered on Instagram at Gered_Mankowitz. Check it out. I'll have all the information in the episode notes for this week. And for the Tenant Podcast, I'm Todd Pearson.
And I'm Wes Brown.
Have a great week.